Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. A few years ago now, my wife and I welcomed our first child into the world. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time, and while that was certainly okay for a young, childless couple, we knew that we'd need more room to start a family. We started looking online and eventually found a suitable property in a pretty prominent part of our home city. But for reasons of our own personal security, that place will remain nameless for the rest of this story. The homes in this particular bit of the city were built by Celtic migrant workers almost 100 years ago now and are known as being sturdy, reliable, and affordable places to live. As you can imagine, they were incredibly popular with just about every other wannabe renter. So when me and my wife saw one of the houses there was available, we jumped at the chance to book a viewing and put a deposit down. About 6 weeks later, we were moved in, and it felt every bit the milestone that we thought it would. Our neighbors were warm and welcoming, and apart from the occasional busload of tourists, the area itself was actually nice and quiet. But then, the landlords proposed a rent hike. We were still very fresh when we got the news, so at first we had no idea how to really approach it. But then, right as we were approaching full-on panic, we got the news that a renters' union was undertaking a little investigation on our behalf, and we had to wait a few weeks to get the news, but when we did, we were over the moon. The landlords were backing down on the rent hike, and we were only going to be looking at a 3% annual raise instead of a whopping 12%. Neither me nor my wife had any inkling of what the renters' union had discovered, and we assumed they'd found some kind of bylaw that prevented the landlords from such a steep hike. But nothing could have prepared us for the truth. Nothing at all. The news about the rent hike was a stressful time for us, so I wasn't surprised when I started having these weird, recurring dreams. I just never expected them to be so vivid. The dreams would always start with me returning home from an errand, such as food shopping or a haircut, and I'd turn onto our street to find our house unlike I remembered it. All the other houses were the same regular red brick with copper brown trim, whereas ours was just jet black all over. The roof, the brick, the doors, even the windows appeared to have been painted the deepest shade of coal dust black I'd ever seen. I'd approach the house with the neighbors watching me from their windows and open doors, but as soon as I unlocked the front door and walked inside my home, the dream would end and I'd wake up. I told my wife about the dreams and the things that I saw in them, but she agreed it was probably the stress of the move playing on my mind. Now, I tried eating better, getting more exercise, and even stopped drinking alcohol altogether, but the dreams still wouldn't go away. They just visited me less frequently. They weren't exactly a hindrance at all. I could still go about my business as usual, but seeing as I'd never had any kind of reoccurring dreams before, it was definitely something that played on my mind a fair bit and made me wonder if I should just go and see my GP about it. Now, part of the reason that I reckoned that I could carry on as normal was because I work from home. I was head of a customer service department for a major electronics chain over here in the UK, so 90% of my job involved working from my home computer to take calls and resolve tickets. And this suited me down to the ground, as not only could I put in long hours with relative comfort, but it meant that I could look after our baby daughter while my wife was at work as a nurse. She also worked very long hours, you see, and very hard too, I might add, so it meant a lot to her that I could stay home with our daughter and make sure that she was well looked after. And so one day I'm working downstairs in the living room and my daughter is watching cartoons. I made myself a cup of iced coffee and then set it down on the coffee table in the middle of the room. But then the next thing I know, my daughter kicks her legs while bursting out laughing, and she boots one of the table legs and the coffee goes spilling all over the floor. It was a full cup, one of those big plastic coffee shop cups too, so almost a full pint of iced coffee was spilling all over the hardwood floor. I rushed to get some paper towels and the anti-stain spray, not wanting to lose any money by voiding our deposit. But then when I got back, I noticed something strange about the spillage. It was sort of forming a puddle. The puddle was a rough circle, forming in the center of the floor, and every time I'd take a wipe at it, the liquid would take the shape of that same rough circle again. I quickly realized there was a very subtle dip in the floorboards, one that must have been hidden with the rug that we'd moved when we decided to redecorate the room a little. And not wanting to end up getting charged for it, we reported the discovery to the landlords immediately. They sent someone over right away, just a general handyman I think it was, and after a quick inspection of the floor, they told us that we need some serious work done to prevent the floor from rotting away completely. Using one of those tiny tube cameras, the kind that you feed into small places, the inspectors were able to determine that a series of short wooden supports had rotted away underneath the floor. These had been attached to the home's foundations, but only in one section which appeared sunken, kind of like a well. And in short, we could get a hotel around the corner for about a week, and after maybe 3 or 4 days of work and a subsequent inspection, we'd be able to return our baby daughter to a safe, clean, stable home. But unfortunately, that's not quite exactly how things went down. We did as instructed and booked ourselves into a small hotel for a week, a very bare-bones place just a couple of miles away from our new house. Then, about 3 days into our week-long stay, we got a call from one of our neighbors saying the police were outside of our house. Not just any police either. They were in a forensics van wearing those all-white coveralls. I drove over as soon as the wife got home from the gym because obviously I needed to know what was happening in our new house. But when I got there, the police turned me away at the door. They'd take my phone number and they'd be in touch once they knew what the situation was. But for the time being, we were in the dark and I had to stay away. It took a week before the landlords called us to let us know that the work was completed. When they did, I demanded a personal inspection before we moved back in, and the woman who called agreed to share everything she knew when I met her at the house. When I arrived, a brand new matching floor had been installed and everything looked just as I remembered it. I obviously didn't test the new floor by pouring a drink over it, but I was assured that the foundations had been renovated and that the issue was now resolved. It was then that I asked what caused the police to come round, because if it was serious enough to involve the law, it was serious enough that we needed to know about it too. And that's when the woman sat me down over a cup of tea and laid it all out for me. First thing, they were offering a rent freeze for 3 years if we promised not to talk about this until after we'd moved out. And since we've been moved out of that house for a number of years now, I'm obviously free to talk about it now. The second thing was that the woman had sworn statements from not one, but 2 council-approved structural engineers, both of whom were happy to attest to our home's safety and security. So if we did choose to move back in, we could sleep soundly knowing that there were no structural issues. Those were all well and good, but what I wanted more than anything to know was to find out what was under our floor. And then after signing my half of a 36-month rental agreement, she spilled the beans quite spectacularly. Almost 100 years ago, when the streets and the houses were still brand new, a family had welcomed a child into the world. But this child was not one they had expected. I can't remember exactly what the poor child's condition was. I'm not even sure the authorities had it entirely sussed out either. But it was clear that whatever it was as debilitating as it was severe. She couldn't walk like other children, she couldn't talk like other children, and by every estimation, she didn't act like other children either. Then as a result, she never made it into double-digit ages. It's also clear that whatever happened to the poor girl, her parents couldn't find it in themselves to take her to the local cemetery. Maybe it was just too expensive to hire an undertaker or whatever, and maybe they had a hand in her death. Either way, they evidently decided the best place for their dearly departed daughter was under the house they built with their own hands. Since there was no one left alive to question and no one left alive to charge, the police simply moved the girl's remains someplace that they could properly dispose of her. After that, they closed their investigation and allowed the renovations to recommence. Then, after a week or so later, there I was, sitting in that exact same space, talking myself back into moving back in. There was just enough time for us to back out if we really wanted to. My wife still had to sign her part of the form as the second adult occupant, but even once I'd explained the whole situation to her, she thought the same thing I did. It was too late to start the whole process of moving again. Doing it one time had been exhausting, so facing it all over again was just kind of unthinkable, even if that did mean staying in a house where the 100-year-old corpse of a severely disabled girl had been recently found. Once my wife had signed her half of the paperwork, we moved back in the next day, and over the next couple of weeks, I stopped having those weird dreams where I'd find our house had turned that sort of inky shade of black. The scariest part of the recurring dream was this. I'm a grounded scientific guy, but I don't have a hard time explaining the dream. Before the renovations, when there was an illegal burial site under our house, who knows what kind of mold or spores or decay could have been drifting up from that sepulcher underneath our feet, affecting my mental state or that of my loved ones. I had dreams, similar dreams, but they were never quite the same. I'd turn onto our street after running whatever errand I'd been on, only to find our house looking the exact same as all the others. No one would be watching from their windows, no one would be peeking out from around their doors. I'd just walk inside as per usual and then wake up feeling refreshed and clear-headed. And things carried on like that for years, as if nothing had ever happened. And then one day, me and my wife decided that we wanted a little more room, and we moved into a 3-bedroom house a couple of miles away from the first. My daughter still doesn't know what they found or why we had to move out of that new house for a week, and I'm not sure she remembers any of it to begin with. Maybe I'll tell her one day, or maybe I'll show her the video you end up putting this story in if you do end up using this. Hopefully it'll make it an easier thing to handle, but I think the word hopefully is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. My name is Joseph, and I'm from Austria. Many years ago, I went on a long-awaited dream holiday to Paris, France. I'd always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, walk along the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honor, explore the catacombs, and visit Notre Dame Cathedral. It's such a tragedy what happened to that. But I finally saved up enough money to take the time off from my job as a chef and surprise my girl with a trip to the City of Love. We drove there from our home country of Austria and had a nice road trip on the way, staying at various locations and making many happy memories. Then we reached Gay Paris. It really was the most romantic city. We dined under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and the twinkling city lights. We took long walks along the Seine and made love in our hotel room with the windows open to the late-night city. Apologies if this is not appropriate to share, but we Europeans are just sort of a free people who are not ashamed of our love for beautiful women. It was perhaps our 4th day in Paris, when myself and my lover Amelia were seated in a cafe awaiting our latest delectable taste of French cuisine. I had parked our car on the street outside. There was a parking space next to it, and I thought nothing of it, as the average car would be able to fit in there. A man came driving along and idled beside the space. The movement caught my eye, and I watched him with some curiosity, as I am always interested to see how other people maneuver into parking spaces. I forget the brand of car that this man had, but it was clearly too big for him. He did not possess the necessary skill to navigate into the parking space. Instead of giving up and moving on, however, he began to use his vehicle to shunt the cars on either side of the space in order to widen the gap. My car included, of course. Shunting a parked car like that can shatter the steering column or the axles, and this absolute Oslock was going hog wild doing it to my car, and that of the hapless stranger parked adjacent to me. Naturally, I rushed out of the cafe and into the street. I yelled at him, in German, forgetting myself for a moment, and he pulled his car to a stop, pushed against mine, and climbed out. This man was a burly, dirty-looking dock worker type who fit every stereotype of the rough and vulgar Frenchman that I'd ever seen growing up. Nothing like the actual people I'd encountered in Paris thus far, I might add. I could tell that he didn't understand a word that I was saying to him in German, but my French is pretty merda, so I tried English. I told him that he would damage my car and the neighboring car and his own car too, and to stop being a dep and go and park somewhere else if he wasn't able to fit a stupid vehicle in the space. And the man called me a filthy Spanish pig, and then told me to go back to Spain. I raised an eyebrow at him and called him a slur that I probably shouldn't have said, a very rude word in Austrian that sounds a little like foot but means something very different. And this was a big mistake because apparently he understood enough to know what I was insulting him with. And this burly man almost leaped over the hood of his car and came running towards me. He jabbed one huge finger right into my chest, almost knocking me backwards as he did so. I really hoped that Amelia would stay in the cafe and not draw attention to the fact that she was with me. Now this road rage Frenchman began to yell at me, and spit was flying from his lips. Now in English, I asked him to politely back off, but instead, he grabbed me and pushed me up against the wall. He put one fist next to my head in a clearly threatening gesture and began screaming right into my face. In that moment, I understood why they become road rage incidents, because I felt the anger burning inside me too. How dare this boorish man yell at me and get spit in my face? I was a visitor to his city. Besides, he was the one who had repeatedly shunted that car like some moronic bull. So I said this to him, trying my best to seem angry and threatening, and then shoved him backwards to get him off of me. Now this was a huge mistake. The Frenchman barely budged, and then sneered at me and started laughing. He drew his fist back, ready to clock me in the jaw. I ducked, and then he punched the granite wall behind me. Now, no sooner had he started to howl than I delivered a kick to his nether regions and ducked under his arm. Now, I probably should have kicked him harder because it did absolutely nothing to slow the enraged Frenchman driver down. He reached out to grab me, and I could see actual murder in his eyes. He was snarling and frothing like some kind of drunken animal, and I'm sure he was indeed plastered even though it was only 3 p.m. My moment of confidence was over. I bolted, running from that angry driver down the street calling for help. Paris, which had once seemed such a romantic and wonderful place, now seemed hostile and uninviting to me. Passers-by looked on with just blank dismissal as I thundered down the sidewalk, my lumbering aggressor behind me. Thankfully, I was fitter, healthier, and smarter than him. I darted through a crowd, then across a courtyard, and eventually found myself looking at the Louvre Pyramid. An art gallery and museum seemed like the perfect place to lose a man such as this, so I darted past the glass structure, ducked into a building, and quickly found a public toilet. I hid in there and called Amelia on my cell and asked her to keep an eye out for the guy. She told me she was still in the cafe and that the police had been called, and the man's car was being clamped and towed. I stayed in the line with her as she described the next scene. The angry driver returned to his car and saw officers milling around the vehicle. I suppose in his drunken stupor, he mistook one of the officers for me and began to grab him, and then got forcibly thrown to the ground and subdued with batons. Amelia described it to me as I cowered in the bathroom, and I have never been more grateful in my life to miss out on something. The man and his car were carted away, and I have no idea what became of him, and I really don't care to know. Thankfully, our car was undamaged and we enjoyed the rest of our trip to Paris, but I have never trusted French drivers to park their cars properly to this day. My name's Adam, and I'm from Leeds here in the UK. And a few years ago, myself and my parents and my sister moved into a new house not too far from our old one. It was a semi-detached place in a quiet street with a neat front gardens and old-fashioned street lamps. We had nice neighbors too, at least on one side anyway, who called over to introduce themselves with some cake and a cup of tea. But those were the neighbors in the houses surrounding us. The ones in the house attached to ours was very, very different. They didn't smile, they didn't wave, and they'd either ignore us if they saw us in the street or stare from their windows if they got the chance, with these very cold, unfriendly stares. Mom said to ignore them. Dad said that some people were just kind of like that, so rather than do anything silly to try and make them like us, we did our best to just ignore it and settle in and not let it bother us. Despite all that, the first couple of weeks were as normal as we could expect. I went to the same school, got used to playing football in the new garden, and helped Mom and Dad unpack boxes of garden furniture. Friends and family stopped over to check out the new house, and while they were mostly interested in the new place, they'd sometimes ask about the neighbors and what they were like. Mom used to say that they were quiet. Dad used to say that he'd met nicer people. And my parents never said anything overly bad about them, but people got the message. They weren't the friendliest of neighbors, and that was that. I sometimes used to wonder aloud why they were so unfriendly with us, but I never got an answer. Mom said that we should just leave them alone, and hopefully they just carry on leaving us alone too. But as it turned out, just living next door to them was a liability. One night I was up in my room playing a bit of FIFA when I heard these noises outside. It sounded like car doors slamming, footsteps on the path outside, and low voices. It sounded extremely suspicious, so I got up and peeked out my window to see what was going on. In the driveway of the house next door, I saw shadows moving in the dark. I couldn't see faces, just sort of hooded shapes moving around. And then seconds later, the shapes piled into a car and sped off. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe the neighbors just had some late visitors, and then I went back to playing video games. But not before leaving my window open, something I look back on as a kind of like fate at this point. I say that because maybe only a minute or two later, I started smelling something burning, and then I heard the shouts outside. I ran to the window and saw flames all over the front door of our attached neighbor. Not just inside either, outside too, with these bright orange and yellow flames making their driveway glow as smoke climbed into the air. I grabbed my phone and called 999. Then, when Dad heard me asking for the fire brigade, he came running to see what was happening. He took one look at the flames and then shouted at us to get out of the house. All of us ran outside right away, grabbing only what was essential before standing on the pavement in our socks or bare feet. It seemed like the whole neighborhood was gathered out there by then, watching from their driveways or the street outside their homes. Apparently, the neighbors that had been targeted weren't home. We knew because their car was gone. But just the thought of them being targeted like that was still deeply shocking to us. A few minutes later, the fire engines arrived and men in heavy gear jumped out before hosing down the flames. Everyone cheered when the firemen finally put out the fire, but the neighbor's house was still a mess. The firemen checked our house too to make sure that there was no danger or risk or anything. They said the fire hadn't spread to our side, but the smell of smoke still clung to everything and made it so we couldn't just kind of carry on and try to forget. We went back inside, but I couldn't get to sleep for ages thanks to the adrenaline and that grim burn smell. The next day, some police stopped by to ask questions and take statements. I don't think they even finished before word got around to us. The fire wasn't some accident. It was a deliberate attack, just like we'd suspected. And that was the first time that I heard the word arson, and it wouldn't be the last. The only questions left were things like, who would do something like that and for what reason? And then we heard about the other fire. Just a few nights before ours, a house on the other side of the city had burned in an almost identical arson attack, and it didn't take long before the police started to think that the two fires were somehow connected. Everyone reckoned that it must have been some kind of retaliation, and the fact that neighbors weren't home at the time made us think they probably knew that it was coming and probably knew who did it too. It probably explained why they were so standoffish with us too. If they had those kinds of beefs going with people, it was probably just their default setting to be wary and cautious of strangers. Maybe they knew they were putting ourselves at risk just by living next door to them and didn't want to get close because they knew that it'd further put us in harm's way. And the neighborhood was quiet for a while after that. As the one who saw the fire start, I couldn't help but feel jumpy at times. Every noise made me think of footsteps or car doors. Mom and Dad tried to act normal, but I saw them watching the street too, especially when the moving truck showed up and started helping the neighbors move out. In the weeks after, nothing else happened. There were no more fires, no more strange noises, and slowly but surely the neighborhood got back to normal as kids felt safe enough to play out in the street again. The neighbor's house stayed empty for a while with a for sale sign out in the front, and it stayed like that for ages as the grass grew tall in their garden. They were gone, but their house was a reminder, a dark, broken thing next to ours that took years before the estate agents found a buyer. I've never forgotten what happened and how that night could have been much, much different should that fire have spread any quicker. A few years ago, I went on vacation from the States to Eastern Europe. Now, I don't want to say exactly which country I went to, because it was most definitely wonderful and I don't want to give it a bad name. I did a lot of traveling around the country, and while most of the places I visited were great, with awesome people and some pretty sick food, just an awesome time in general, there were a couple of joints that were absolutely seedy as hell. One of them was a town I'll just call Hellville. I stayed here for a week when I was backpacking, and I was meeting a female friend a week later and planned to spend a bunch of time with her. So for now, I was just kicking back and exploring this little town of Hellville that I found en route to her digs. I could tell that it was a sketchy place as soon as I hopped off the bus into town. It had a vibe kind of like Eli Roth's Hostel, and my dumb self found that pretty exciting. I'd joked the whole time before my vacation that I was going to stumble across some backwoods village where the locals kidnap tourists for the entertainment of rich sickos, and I was almost excited by the fact that this place looked like it had potential. Yes, I know that I was, and am, an idiot. The first night I got way too drunk in the local Hellville dive bar and almost got into a fight with a Chechnyan ex-military guy, until we realized it was a big misunderstanding and ended up dancing and singing through the streets. Matthias became a good buddy then, and we exchanged cell phone numbers. He was backpacking through Europe too, and in our drunken stupor, we worked out that our routes would intersect a bunch more times, so we should look each other up. Feeling good for making a new friend, especially a badass Czech former soldier, I collapsed into bed in my hostel, being snapped at to shut the F up by more than one angry traveler. The next day, I went exploring Hellville. There wasn't really much to explore, just a few unhygienic-looking bars and cafes, a central square with an honest-to-God village well in it, which I was certain would give me cholera, and then a bunch of farmland. I took a stroll through the countryside to see if I could find any of those classic European milkmaids hard at work in the fields. Sadly not, but I did spy a few gruff-looking farmers and a group of teens in tracksuits that I didn't really like the look of. They were sitting on a fence, chattering in their language, and I could tell that they were talking about me because they were pointing at me and then whispering to each other and laughing. Despite being my arrogant self, I decided to make like a tree and split. I tried to look as casual as possible, but quickly broke into a jog. Now my heart sank as I heard footsteps and the sound of teenage voices behind me. A couple of them sprinted ahead to catch up with me and stood blocking my route back into town. There must have been 5 or 6 guys in total, 4 eventually facing me and then 2 big meatheads blocking off the return path. One of them pointed to my shoes and said something about trainers. I didn't understand for a moment, and then he muttered something about Nikes and then sneakers. I remembered Europeans referred to sneakers as trainers and then realized that he was saying that he liked my Nikes. I said back, yeah, that they were nice sneakers, but very cheap ones. Now this was true, they were probably only $100, nothing to get excited about. This caused the teens to start laughing cruelly, and then the obvious ringleader pointed at my shoes again and referenced that "damn Daniel" meme from years ago. I politely laughed and he began to shove me, saying something in his language that I didn't understand. I could tell from his body language that he was asking why I was laughing at him though, which I'm sorry, but I thought that that's what you're supposed to do when someone says a meme, even if it's an ancient dead one. I had no idea how to convey it to this guy though, who clearly just wanted to start trouble with me. His buddy, a fat pig-looking guy with a Michael Cera bum-fluff mustache, also pointed at my shoes and told me to take them off in some broken English. Now, under no circumstances was I gonna give these a-holes my sneakers. They might have been cheap Nikes, but they were mine, and they served me pretty well on my backpacking trip so far. I told them to F off, and then realized that this might not be a good idea when there were 6 of them and 1 of me. I turned to leave and realized that one of the bigger guys blocking my path was actually carrying a knife. Now, it was only a Swiss Army knife and looked rusty as hell, but I didn't really like my chances of survival if that thing went into my gut. I was surrounded on both sides, so I did the one thing they hadn't counted on. I leaped the fence to my right and began to sprint across the fields like I was back in high school track. These teens started yelling and shouting, and I heard a crash from behind me as they leaped and toppled over the fence. One of them, probably the fat kid, had fallen to the ground and tripped a couple of more of them up. I continued to sprint, glancing over my shoulder and saw that 3 of them were still following, including the leader and the one with the knife. Now this knife guy wasn't that fast, but the leader was leaping over ditches and all sorts of stuff and clearly knew the land better than I did, so he was gaining on me. I kept running, looking for help of some kind, any kind. Did they even have cops patrolling the streets here? I certainly hadn't seen any kind of law enforcement. Hell, I'd take a miserable-looking farmer at this point. Surely these teens wouldn't stab me to death for my sneakers in front of the villagers. I had no idea what the place might be like though. My mind went back to how I'd joked about looking for a town like in the movie Hostel, and I cursed myself for being such an idiot. I wasn't even going to die in a cool way by having my eyes cut out or my wiener fed to dogs or anything. I was going to get murdered in the middle of some ass-backwards nowhere place just because these kids wanted my $100 sneakers. Hell no, I thought. I doubled my efforts and leaped across the fields, vaulting a fence or two in order to escape my pursuers. A stone whistled past my head, and then another, and I realized the teens had stopped to scoop up projectiles at some point, and I was now in serious danger of getting my skull cracked as well as a knife between my ribs probably. A voice in the back of my head told me that maybe I should just hand the sneakers over, but my ego wouldn't allow it. Instead, I managed to run to the village. The first place I thought to go was the local bar, and thank all that is holy, my ex-military pal Matthias was actually sitting at the bar, just nursing a Coca-Cola or something and chatting to the barkeep. Now I quickly ran up to him and told him that the kids were trying to kill me. He started laughing, patted me on the back, and said that he was sure that I could look after myself. And for some reason he thought that I meant little children were trying to kill me. And I frantically insisted that no, it was a gang of late teens, one of them had a knife, and they were also throwing rocks. And the door burst open, and the 3 pursuers came in. The bartender said something in her language that I could tell was probably derogatory, and the ringleader of these youths snapped something back. Matthias jumped to his feet, knocking a stool over, and stood towering over even the biggest of the 3 teens. In that moment, I saw F around and find out playing out in real time. Matthias reached around the back of his belt and produced a small bag, which I realized was some kind of military-looking club. He slapped it against his palm and stepped forward. The kids froze, unsure whether to size up to Matthias or run. In the end, The bartender made the decision for them. He stepped out from the back room, shotgun in hand, and pumped it and pointed it at them. The boys started frantically apologizing, and the barman yelled something that I later found out meant, "I'm going to tell your fathers and you'll be getting the beating of a lifetime." Matthias and the barman explained to me that American sneakers are a valuable commodity to the teenagers in that country, and I should probably wear older, crappier-looking shoes if I'm going to travel around there. And Matthias even promised to hook me up with a pair of his army boots, which later he did. Now, they were 3 sizes too big for me, but I wore them with pride and still own them to this day. That night, Matthias and the barman treated me to a few drinks, and Matthias regaled me with some tales from when he was in the military. And all I can say is that I'm glad he and I did not get into a fight the night before, and I'm almost happy for the teens that they backed down when they did. Man, Matthias can be scary at times, and I'm still in touch with him to this day via email sporadically. He travels Europe like some kind of Jack Reacher drifter, only without the wild adventures, but I like to think that if he needed to throw down, he would. Now, I moved on from Hellville the next day and went to visit my female friend early. I was not sad to be out of that village, and looking back, I cannot believe how dumb I was to fight for my life instead of just handing over those damn sneakers. But on the other hand, they were nice sneakers and I paid for them with my own money. No deranged European kids get to steal my shoes. My name is Terry, and this is a story from back when me and my family moved into our first real home together. So back in 1994, my wife and I and our 2 kids moved into a big house down in a quiet Texas town. The house was very old but very beautiful, with huge bay windows and a massive backyard. And the yard was maybe half the size of a football field, and it was filled with thick grass and old trees. But while my wife, Angie, and I told ourselves we'd explore every inch of it before we moved in, we had much more pressing issues at hand. And so the whole thing got put on the back burner until much later on. We loved the open space, and as long as we did the occasional snake check to make sure that there were no rattlers around, the backyard seemed like the perfect place for our 2 kids to play. And that house felt like a fresh start, a place to make memories, and for the first few weeks, nothing could have been better. But then, my 2 kids found something that changed everything for us. Sarah Jane was 10 and Jack was 8, so they were just as excited about that backyard as we were. Once we made sure that there were no unexpected hazards and we'd given most of the lawn a little trim, the kids were free to chase each other around all over the place. But then one afternoon, they came running inside looking very excited. Then, when their mom asked them what was going on, they explained how they thought that they had actually found buried treasure in the backyard. I followed them outside, curious and not worried at all, and they led me to a spot near the back of the yard where we'd had a gardener trim back the bushes. And there, half buried in the ground, was a heavy metal door. It looked old and rusted at the edges, with a thick lock holding it firmly shut. And I hadn't noticed it before. Angie and I must have missed it, and the landscaper must have thought that we knew about it already. Now, the kids begged to open it, but I told them to stay back. Jack said that it was buried treasure, left there by a pirate, and I told him whatever it was probably not any kind of treasure. Pirates keep their treasure in bank accounts these days, not underground in chests. And the door looked heavy, but after clipping off the lock with a pair of bolt cutters, I managed to pull it open, which revealed a dark staircase which led down under the ground. And the air smelled damp, cold, and rotten, no place for any kid to be. So, after making them promise not to go down without my permission, I grabbed a flashlight from the house and shone it down into that hole. And the steps were concrete, and while they looked pretty worn, they appeared very sturdy for their age. I told the kids to wait where they were, and I assured them that I'd share anything I'd found and then went down alone. Now, just seconds later, my flashlight was lighting up a small room at the bottom. But it wasn't just a room. It looked more like a bunker. It was small, just a single room with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A metal cot sat in one corner with a thin, stained mattress lying on it. And then there was a rusty sink bolted on the wall and a toilet attached to the same wall close by. The fixtures looked very old, just like everything else, but when I walked up to the sink and turned one of the faucet knobs, water came out. Water that was both clear and cold. I figured the place had been abandoned long ago, that maybe it was some Cold War relic that had thankfully never had to serve its purpose. But I was wrong. Someone must have been living down there, and pretty recently too. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering when I pulled its chain, and that's when I saw the scratches on the walls. Deep and uneven, like someone had clawed at them with nothing but their fingernails. Suddenly freaked out by what I'd seen, I climbed back out and closed the door behind me. The kids were waiting, very wide-eyed and excited to hear what I had to say, and so you can imagine their disappointment when I told them that the bunker was entirely off limits. And they tried to argue with me at first, and I had to scare them a little to make sure that they listened by claiming that there might be monsters or even mean wild animals living down there. And that didn't feel great, having to spook my own kids, but as any parent will tell you, you sometimes gotta lay down the law if you want to keep your kids actually safe. And that night, my wife and I talked about what I'd found, and we agreed that not only should we stop the kids from ever seeing what was down in that bunker, but that we better call the cops to let them know what we'd found. The bunker was very unsettling to me. You see, to me, it wasn't just some normal place for storms or maybe even bombs. It might have been built for that, and it might have also served that purpose at one time. But when I saw it, it was almost like a makeshift prison cell. The scratches, the cot, the working plumbing, I felt like they told a story that I didn't want to know. It felt like a secret that we didn't want to be a part of, and we didn't want that secret in our new home. 2 sheriff's deputies stopped by the next day after we called. They followed me to that bunker, and I showed them the metal door in the room below. One of them wrote down some notes while the other asked a bunch of questions, and they checked the sink and the toilet, noting that the water was still working, and agreed that that was probably not a great sign. They also found a small chain bolted to the floor near the cot, something that I hadn't seen during my first visit down there. It looked kind of rusted, but it was still very strong, and my skin wanted to crawl off my bones when I saw that. Stating the obvious, one of the deputies said the bunker was likely used to hold someone, and probably against their will. They didn't say much else, but their faces were obviously very pale as they said this, and they told us that we weren't in any trouble, that we'd done the right thing in reaching out to them. But for the time being, we were to keep that bunker locked. They would investigate and let us know if they did find anything. And that same day, I drove over to the Home Depot in town, bought a brand new padlock, and relocked the door to that bunker. I told our kids obviously to stay away from it. They nodded, but I saw this very deep curiosity in Jack's eyes, like it was another conspiracy to keep him away from the treasure that we'd found down there. And it made me glad that I bought that padlock. It was the only thing stopping him from going down there and seeing all the stuff for himself. And at that age, seeing dark stuff like that can have a terrible effect on a child's mind. The house felt different because the yard didn't feel safe anymore. And I tried to forget it and move on, but every time I was out there in the yard, my mind went to that bunker and all those scratches on the wall. Who had been kept down there? For how long? And most importantly, why? The cops called us back a few days later, but they didn't have the answers we needed. They said they found no records of the bunker anywhere in any files or documents related to the property, and the home's previous owners also claimed no knowledge of it. They were all the way up in Oklahoma and had never visited the property. And then the folks who likely had it built were dead, and there were basically no one to talk to or question that had any solid answers for them. And as a result, the sheriff's department couldn't say who built it or when. And they also found no evidence of a crime, so even if there were folks around to arrest, there was really nothing to charge them with. They told us to keep it locked for safety reasons and that naturally we had the right to concrete it over if we wanted to, maybe to grow a lawn over it, anything we wanted. And I remember thanking them for the time, but also thinking that it was all just kind of pointless. That bunker stayed sealed, like a very dark secret that we kept buried in our backyard. I checked the padlock every week, making sure that it was staying, and I didn't want anyone or anything getting in there, least of all one of our kids. And years had passed by and the kids started to grow up and the bunker stayed off limits, but I knew that they probably still thought about it, especially our son. Sometimes I saw him glance at the bushes that we grew in the backyard, right over where the door was hidden. He didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, almost like a black mark that we couldn't ever wash clean. Angie and I tried to make life as normal as possible for Jack and Sarah Jane. We had backyard barbecues, played some football, and succeeded in filling in the house with joy and laughter and some happy memories. But that bunker was always in the back of our minds, and how could it not be when it was just right under our feet? And as the years passed, Sarah Jane and Jack moved out. Sarah Jane went to college, while Jack got a job in another city, and the house felt empty without them. But I was glad that they were finally away from that thing. Angie and I stayed there, but the house felt a bit too big now, and anytime I was out in the backyard, I just avoided that corner where the bushes hid the door. One night, I woke up at maybe 1 a.m. to take a bathroom trip. I figured that I'd heard it when washing my hands, but when I turned off the faucet, I heard it. This low scraping sound, like metal on stone, and it was coming from the backyard. I quickly made my way downstairs, grabbed my pistol with the little flashlight attachment that I had bought specifically for home defense, and then went out in the backyard. It was cold and almost pitch black out there, but after walking across the lawn, I pushed through the bushes near the back and checked the lock on the bunker door. The padlock was still there, but the dirt around the door looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't convince myself, and a part of me thought that maybe it was Jack, but that seemed insane. Another part of me thought that it was whoever had owned the house before, maybe even the person who had been kept down there. Firstly, I want to begin the story by saying that I do think Egypt is a lovely country. It's populated by many wonderful people, and I have friends that are both immigrants and natives. I have visited the country again since the incident I'm going to tell you about, and I enjoyed my time there. Unfortunately, though, there's no avoiding the fact that attitudes to women in Egypt can be unpleasant. Things are a bit more relaxed in the country in 2025, but when this occurred in 2011, it could be extremely risky for a woman to walk around by herself, especially uncovered. A lot of Egyptian women wear hijabs or niqabs, covering their hair or almost everything apart from their eyes. Of course, Western non-Muslim women visiting Egypt just dress how they normally would, but this can be dangerous and downright stupid if you're alone. And as such, when I first visited Cairo, it was strongly advised that young women cover up as much as possible, make sure that they're with a male chaperone, and stick to the touristy areas. I was most excited about seeing the pyramids and exploring the deserts, and I wasn't even particularly thrilled about spending a few nights in central Cairo before we began our proper tour. Our tour guides insisted that it was totally worth it though, and we needed to experience the city to experience Egypt. As I followed the tour group through the bazaars, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the smells, I was starting to get won over. My dad was engaged in animated discussion with one of the guides, and they become fast friends. Mom just seemed happy to look at the rugs and ornaments for sale, and all the other middle-aged tourists were cooing and awing over the sights. I was the only young woman in her early 20s, and there was a guy my age on the tour group too, but he'd opted out of this afternoon's city tour due to food poisoning, which was really because he was hungover from the night before. Nobody was really paying attention to me, nor did I to them, which is why I didn't notice at first when I lost sight of the tour group. At first I didn't panic. They couldn't have gone far. But when I turned down the next alleyway and found myself in a crowd of unfamiliar Egyptian faces, it did cause me to pause. A few of the older male store owners were looking at me a little strangely, their eyes traveling up and down my body even though I was wearing jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt, the best compromise I could make in this heat. I got pulled along by the throng of the crowd, and before I knew it, I'd been kind of forced into another side of the alley, ducking out of the flow of people just so I could get my bearings. A few young men stood in a doorway, and I knew immediately that they were trouble. They sort of strutted over towards me in the way that certain guys do, and the way they studied my body made the previous store owners look reserved. They looked at me with a barely disguised hunger, and I swear to God, one of them even licked his lips. They started talking to each other in Arabic, and I couldn't understand what most of them had said, but recognized the word for cattle or cow and girl. One of them said something that caused the others to hoot and clap his buddy on the shoulders. I quickly apologized for disturbing them, which was a mistake. I shouldn't have acknowledged them or made eye contact. Before I could step back out of the alley, one of them grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me deeper into the shadows. My blood immediately ran cold. I knew exactly what they wanted to do to me and what the things that they were saying meant. One of them pinned my arms behind my back, while another one started to lift my t-shirt, running his fingers over my stomach. I felt sick and knew that this was it. If I didn't do something now, then this was going to be an event that would define the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. I drew on all my self-defense training and slammed my body back into the guy holding my hands. He hit the wall with a thud, letting go of my wrists. Using the momentum, I kicked forwards at the guy who had been touching me, slamming his head backwards against the first guy's nose as I did so. I heard a crunch and a scream, and quickly pulled free as two of the guys howled in pain. The third guy had been watching, but he was the one that started to chase. I had no idea where I was running to or how I could find safety. There was every chance that I'd just run into more angry young men who were looking to tear me apart. I can't even describe the chase because it was all some blur. All I know is that the man chasing me grabbed my hair and shirt at least a few times, including one where he tore a chunk of the hair out of my scalp, causing me to cry out in pain. It felt like I'd never escaped him. Everywhere I went, crowds were surging forward, and it was only later that I learned that I was on the outskirts of a goddamn armed riot. And I think that's what saved me. Eventually, I burst into a courtyard and saw my parents and the tour group. They all looked frantic and defensive, and I guess that's why our one tour guide who'd befriended my dad was holding a brick. He barely paused as I came sprinting into the courtyard, followed by a guy who was clearly chasing me. The tour guide pulled back his arm and let his brick fly straight and true. I heard it hit my pursuer's head with a loud, hollow clunk, and he just sort of dropped to the floor like a discarded sack of potatoes. The tour guide said it was better that we got out of here because something was clearly going down. So he and the other guide led us down some more side streets and away from what he explained was turning into a full-scale riot. I asked if we should tell the cops about the guys who tried to assault me, and he just sort of laughed. We made it back to the hotel, which was gated and had armed guards. The next day, it was time for the tour group to move on anyway, and we spent the rest of the vacation at a luxury resort near the pyramids, where we lounged by the pool, relaxed, and went on various day trips to ancient historic sites of interest. Now, I love Egypt, and like I say, I've been back there since, but this was the most terrifying experience I've ever had, and one that could have changed my life, all because some people see others as less than human. Many years ago now, when our son was barely out of diapers, me and my kid's mom moved into a real nice duplex out in the suburbs. It was on a quiet street, and the neighbors were quite friendly, and some even actually came over to help us unpack. Now, the guy in the home next door didn't show up, but when we heard that he was some elderly widower who didn't get around so easily anymore, we obviously gave him an instant pass. Now, our son Luke loved the big backyard and pool that we now had. He loved his new bedroom too, but what he didn't love was the big old closet with its sliding wooden doors. He seemed almost cautious of it right away. But then a few nights after we settled in, Luke started acting very strange about his new closet. At first, he said that he wanted to keep it open, so he could see that there were no monsters in there. But then later, he said that he wanted to sleep with it closed because someone was inside the closet and they would watch him whenever we left him alone. I thought that it was just the new house making him nervous, and that his big old imagination was just getting the better of him. And so that night, to help him feel safe, I started what became a regular bedtime routine. Every night I checked his closet for monsters, I opened the doors, rustled his clothes a little, and showed him how, aside from them, it was completely empty. I'd then shut the closet, tuck him into bed, and then maybe sit in the chair and read him a bedtime story until he fell asleep. It worked for him, and he slept like the dead from then on. But for me, that feeling of unease never entirely went away. Something about Luke's fear stuck in my mind, how sort of primal and authentic it actually seemed. His mom said it was probably nothing, just a father worrying too much about his over-imaginative son. But still, I kept checking the closet every night during our little routine, which I increasingly realized wasn't for him anymore, it was for me. Now, a little time went by, maybe 2 or 3 months, and I decided to give Luke's room a deep clean. The house was old, the kind of place where dust settled just about everywhere, so I vacuumed the carpet, wiped all the windows down, and cleaned under his bed too. And then once I was done, I moved to the closet. As I swept the floor, I noticed something against the back wall. It was a little pile of sawdust, maybe an inch or two tall, piled near the back wall. Since I didn't remember seeing sawdust when we moved in, I pushed Luke's clothes aside and looked closer. And then, in that dim light, I saw it, clear as day. A small hole in the wall near the floor, about the size of a coin. There wasn't any light coming through at the time, but it was there all right. I remember my heart rate going into overdrive as these dual feelings of disgust and anger rose up inside me. The hole looked like it went straight through, so I grabbed a flashlight and shined it inside. And that's how I figured out that there was some kind of cover on the other side, something to hide it when it wasn't in use. But I knew someone could see through it if they removed the cover. The wall was shared with the neighbor's house, that elderly widower who lived on the other side of that duplex. I thought about them moving away the paper or card or whatever it was and watching my boy as he slept. And my hands shook as I thought about that. My son hadn't been imagining things. Someone really had been watching him. And so I sat back, staring at that hole. My head was pounding as 1,000 different thoughts raced around in my mind all at once. We never saw that widower much. He was mostly just sort of shadows moving behind curtains. But the thought of him watching my son made me feel sick to my stomach. But not just sick, angry too. I wanted to scream, to run next door and demand answers before taking some well-deserved retribution. But I stopped myself. I knew how it would end. If I confronted him, I wouldn't stay calm and I'd end up in jail for sure. I could feel the anger building, the kind that didn't stop. I'd hurt someone, or worse, for Luke's sake. I couldn't let that happen. I decided that I didn't want that guy to know that I knew, if that made any sense. I wanted to try and actually catch him doing something, maybe on camera, so I had actual evidence of the crime. I went to the garage, found some wood filler and a putty knife, and then worked fast to fill it in and cover it over. I then checked the wall for other holes, and when I didn't find any, I moved Luke's clothes back and swept away the sawdust. The closet looked normal again, but I didn't feel any better. What kind of person drills a hole to watch a child, and how the hell was I going to catch him in the act? My hands clenched into angry fists every time I thought about it, and I only stopped feeling murderously angry after I spoke to Luke's mom about it. And that night, I checked his closet like I always did. My son didn't know about the hole, and there was no way in hell that I was about to tell him on an account of not wanting to scare him. so I tucked him in, turned off the light, and watched him fall asleep as usual. But unlike him, I couldn't relax. Even though the hole was gone, I kept imagining the widower's eyes on the other side of the wall. I imagined him kneeling down and moving away the cover and cursing as he realized someone had gotten wise to his plan. A part of me thought that I'd have him backing off for a while, but I also knew that if he did it once, he was probably going to do it again. I started checking the closet more, during the day too. I'd slid the doors open and stare at the wall, waiting for something to happen or to hear something moving on the other side, but I never saw or heard anything. And the stress of it started to affect my sleep. I started locking the windows and back door every night, and something I never did before. I told myself it was to keep my son safe, but the truth is, I was scared too. Luke's mom felt the same way. She was furious, but she also knew that it was better not to escalate, as any sort of confrontation might go very wrong and very fast. If this guy was willing to drill a hole in the wall to spy on our kid, what else was he willing to do? I never felt the same in that house afterwards, and I never felt the same about that supposedly sweet old widower either. I wanted to catch him doing something, anything to prove what I knew. I paid to have some security cameras installed, which were super expensive compared to those Ring doorbells you can buy these days, and I thought that it'd be worth the investment, but the guy next door never did anything on any cameras. His house stayed dark with his curtains always closed. I thought about calling the police purely just to warn them that I thought our neighbor was a creep. But not only had I removed what little evidence I had, I also wasn't sure how to phrase things to avoid sounding like some paranoid a-hole bullying his elderly neighbor. I felt like an idiot, and I still do actually, but I kept quiet. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, and I told myself it was just for home defense, but deep down, I knew I was ready to use it for home offense. If I heard someone in Luke's room, if I even so much as heard someone creeping around outside, I wouldn't hesitate. I even got excited about the idea of catching the guy, excited about the idea of smashing his head in, and that scared me almost as much as the hole. And after a couple of months went by and still nothing had happened, I started to relax a little. There had been no new holes, no strange noises. Luke hadn't talked about being watched in a while, and the only disturbed sleeps we got were when we'd had an unrelated nightmare. The routine definitely helped a lot in that continual process of checking the closet before tucking him in, but I never stopped checking that wall. I'd run my hand over the spot where the hole was, making sure it was still sealed, but it always was. And then one day I saw a truck outside the widower's house. No goodbye, no explanation, and the house stayed empty, and it took a while, but we actually heard that he'd passed away. And as horrible as it is to say, I actually felt relief. The hole was gone, and so was the sicko who put it in there. But the fact that it even happened in the first place, that there's people out there who'd think to do something like that, that's something I'll never be able to come to terms with. This is a story I tell my buds for a laugh sometimes, but I only laugh about it because otherwise you'd bloody cry, you know? Everything turned out okay, but honestly at the time, I thought my entire life was over, and I'd spent the rest of my days rotting in a Dutch jail. So it all started because me and a mate, Milo, got really into mopeds. We both got mopeds while we were still in school. While the rest of our friends were learning to drive cars, we smugly declared that our little scooters were the most cost-effective, sensible option, and anyone who pissed all their money into the tank of a 4-seater gas guzzler was a right chump. After school, we graduated from just having our CBT, a learner's permit for mopeds, to actually passing our motorcycle tests. We were living large, riding our mopeds around town like a lame British Macklemore, that song he did about mopeds, downtown, which was unironically our theme song if you want to picture exactly the kind of insufferable twats that we were back then. Now one day, Milo excitedly showed me a video that he'd found online, advertising a group moped trip from Poland to the Netherlands. I didn't quite understand the deal at first, but as I watched the video, it seemed like we'd go on a cross-continent moped tour with the group as part of a documentary they were filming. Not only would we get to embark on the trip of a lifetime, but it would cost us almost nothing. As long as we could get ourselves there, we'd be provided with room, board, and moped rental every step of the way. I was a bit sad to have to leave my beloved Vespa behind in the UK, but as for the rest, you could not sniff at that at all. Milo was incredibly enthusiastic about it too, and looking back, I didn't really have the time to pause and wonder if there was some kind of catch. And by the time my girlfriend Jane suggested it seemed too good to be true, I was already fully on board and committed to the idea, so I didn't really want to find any excuses to back out of the trip. I didn't do my due diligence and look into Pete, the guy organizing the tour. Milo said that he had though, and everything was totally on level, so hey, why wouldn't I believe my childhood best friend? We flew to Poland a couple of months later, and honestly I'd be lying if I said that the trip wasn't great. It was our first time going on a foreign holiday and we really relished it. The moped journey from Poland to the Netherlands was great fun, even if it took some getting used to riding a different machine, and me, Milo, and the 3 other guys and Pete all got on really well. After some days of fun, frolics, and breakneck moped driving, we pulled into the parking lot of the hotel we were going to be staying at in the Netherlands. Immediately, it was very obvious that this was a brothel, and I shot Milo a look. This is not what we'd agreed upon. Jane would certainly not be okay with me staying in a damn brothel. Luckily for Jane, she wouldn't have to worry about it. We parked up our mopeds outside, climbed off, and then suddenly, floodlights slammed on in the darkness, and loud voices were yelling. I didn't understand what was being said, but as a group of armed cops stormed into view, I understood the premise. Get down on the ground with your hands above your head. I complied, but I was almost laughing. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no reason why I should be getting arrested by armed cops. My confidence remained as they forced open the seats of our mopeds and threw our stuff to the ground. Some changes of clothes I'd stashed under the seat, nothing of note. One of the officers yanked the backpack off my back and emptied the contents onto the ground. I watched in dawning horror as an armed cop snatched up my passport and pocketed it. Then another cop began slicing open the seats of the mopeds. That's when my confidence really dissipated. I stared open-mouthed as they pulled 2 duct tape packages out of the seat cushioning that I'd spent the last few days sitting on. I didn't have to ask to know what I'd been sitting on, though. Struggling to look around at Milo, who was being nailed on by a cop, the look on his face caused my heart to completely sink. The absolute imbecile was not at all surprised to see the drugs. My best friend had implicated me in a freaking cocaine smuggling operation without my knowledge. No wonder it had been too good to be true. No wonder Pete was such a nice guy. I'd known Milo had a few dodgy contacts and dabbled in very light dealing back at home, but I had no idea he'd done anything like this. Protesting my innocence did not help though, as I was dragged into a waiting paddy wagon and then booked and processed in a Dutch jail and thrown into a single cell where I had nothing to do but sit, fret, and poop myself in fear. Not literally. I'd never even been in trouble with the law before, and the idea that I could genuinely be going to prison, that I had actually committed a serious crime, even unwittingly. The next few days were a blur of terror and anxiety. I could not make an international call to let Jane know what was going on. I could not get a hold of Milo and wring that idiot's neck while demanding he explain things. All I could do was talk to a couple of Dutch cops who barely spoke English, but knew just enough to tell me that I was in a whole heap of trouble. In the end, it was Pete who proved to be my savior, even if he was the ringleader and the guy to blame in the first place. Milo clammed up, refusing to say anything in my defense, but in the end Pete spilled everything and cut some kind of deal where he ratted out his suppliers. Part of the deal involved telling them that myself and 2 of the 3 other guys were just clueless patsies, brought along to drive the extra mopeds. Only Pete, Milo, and a 3rd guy, Jacob, were actually part of the drug smuggling. The day that a guy from the UK embassy came to visit me in my cell and told me I was going home, I genuinely fell to my knees and wept. I went home and hugged my mom and dad and had a bang-up Sunday roast. My homecoming to Jane wasn't quite so grand, though. I don't think she ever quite believed me that I wasn't involved in the criminal enterprise, and honestly, that really hurt. I'd never done anything to make her distrust me, and after 6 months of constant jibes and jokes about my complicity, I couldn't stand it anymore, and we actually ended up breaking up. Even though the Dutch law accepted that I had no knowledge of the drug smuggling, I was still deported and banned from entering the Netherlands for 10 years. That time's just up about now, and not sure why I'd ever want to go back though, unless for some reason I wanted to visit Milo, who's still serving 2 more years on his sentence. I have no sympathy for that idiot. Even after Pete spilled the beans, Milo pleaded not guilty and got a much longer sentence because of it. It's like the American Wesley Snipes said, "Some mother lovers always trying to drive a moped up a hill." About 20 years ago now, my wife and I decided that we need more room for our family, so we picked out a house for sale that was within our budget and then went through the process of purchasing it and moving in. Now to us, the house was perfect for ourselves and our 2 kids, named Lily and Max. They loved their new bedrooms, they loved the backyard and its outdoor pool, and it was actually western facing too, so we could sit out there and enjoy the sunset every night. And the neighborhood was quiet, with friendly people who waved if they passed while I was mowing the front lawn. And it felt like our own little slice of paradise, a place where nothing bad could really happen. We were happy and I thought that we'd found our forever home. Now weeks and weeks went by and everything stayed great. The kids played in the yard while my wife got accustomed to the new kitchen, and I was as happy as all heck with the size of the new garage. We felt very safe, like pretty much nothing could touch us. But one night, everything changed. It was late and the house was dark. The kids were asleep, Emma was in bed reading, and I was about to lock the front doors when I heard a loud noise outside. It was sort of a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the door. I kept on listening for a minute or two, and then when I didn't hear anything else, I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a car's trunk slamming in the distance. I went over to the back of the house to lock the back doors, and that's when I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, and they were only getting louder, but before I could move, the door in front of me crashes open. After being thrown back, I saw the men rush in. They were wearing black with their faces hidden behind masks. They carried flashlights and bags, and one even had some type of blunt object like a crowbar. And my legs felt weak, but I couldn't run. I had to protect my family. And the second they saw me, they rushed forward. There were 4 of them, tall, very well built. He pushed me into the living room as my wife stood at the top of the stairs, looking pale and frightened. Lily and Max woke up and ran to join her, and I wanted to tell them to run, to hide, but my voice couldn't work. It was like a dream. The men ordered my wife and kids downstairs too, and they shoved us onto the couch. They then stood over us with those flashlights that were bright, blinding us, which I guess was kind of part of their plan. Finally, one of them stepped closer. He was the tallest, and his mask was black with holes for his eyes and mouth, and he leaned down, so close that I could smell his stinking breath. He didn't speak, but his eyes were burned into mine. Another man, shorter with a red mask, started pacing back and forth. He kicked over some lamp and it shattered on the floor. The sound started to make Lily cry and Emma pulled her closer. The tall one grabbed my shirt and pulled me to my feet. His flashlight was shining in my face and I squinted trying to see. The others circled us. They were like wolves circling prey. The men wanted something specific, but I didn't have much, only enough to start our new life. But that didn't seem to deter them. They carried on, searching, tearing through drawers and shelves, throwing books and dishes to the floor. One of them, with a kind of greenish mask, found a picture of us at the beach. He stared at it, and then at me. His head was tilted, like he was confused. The tall one grabbed my arm again, harder this time. He shook me, and I stumbled. Emma screamed, and Max clung to her, his face buried in her side. I wanted to fight, to push them away, but there were too many, and they were too strong. The tall one dragged me to the kitchen. He threw me against the counter, and pain shot through my ribs as I slammed into it. The others brought Emma and the kids, forcing them to sit on the floor. Lily was sobbing now, and Max's eyes were huge, like he didn't understand what was happening. I didn't either, but I had to try and stay strong for them, no matter how hard that was. The men started ripping open cabinets, pulling out pots and pans. They weren't looking for food or money. They were looking for something else, something we didn't have, but they seemed damn sure that it was there. I remember how the short one in the greenish mask suddenly stopped and pulled one of our kitchen knives from the block that held it. Emma gasped and I felt sick. The knife was long and sharp, and as he held it close to her face, my hand shook and my legs were feeling like jelly. The tall one grabbed me again, his fingers digging into my arm. He leaned close and his mask was brushing my cheek, and I could hear his breathing, very fast and heavy. They wanted something that was hidden, but they didn't say what, and I didn't know what they meant. We had no gold, no jewels, no valuable secrets hidden anywhere. That was a brand new home, our new start. All the money we had in the world was in its foundations, not in the walls or the closets. I tried to think, to remember if we found anything strange in that house, but nothing could come to mind. Just boxes and paint cans and old furniture from the last owners. I told the men that much, but they didn't believe a word of what I'd said. The one with the knife stepped closer to Emma and my world started to go dark. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't let them hurt her or the kids. The man in the green mask stopped again. He was looking at the picture, then at us. He grabbed the tall one's arm and pointed at me. They stepped back, their heads close together. I couldn't hear them, but they were arguing in whispers before one of them suddenly said, "Shut this up! It's not here!" The tall one shook his head, but the green masked man kept pointing. He picked up another picture, one of us moving in, and stared at it. His shoulders were slumped and he dropped the picture. The others froze, watching the two guys argue. Then suddenly they backed away. The tall one let go of me and I fell to my knees. The man with the knife lowered it, stepping back. They looked at each other and then at us, and then without a word, they turned and walked out no faster than they'd come in. The house was silent except for my daughter's sobs and my heavy breathing. Emma crawled over to me and we held the kids tight. My hands were shaking as I checked them for cuts and bruises, and everyone was okay. We were just terrified. I called the police. They came pretty quickly. Their lights were flashing through the windows as we went out to meet them. They searched the house and the yard and the street outside. They found footprints in the mud, but that was pretty much it. These men were gone. The police asked questions, wrote things down, and promised to look for them. But from what I told them, and I agreed with this, they said it was a mistake, that the men thought we were someone else. Maybe the last owners, maybe someone with some valuables hidden somewhere, but they didn't know who. The police never found the men, no one was arrested, and we fixed the broken lamp and cleaned up the mess. The house didn't feel like paradise anymore. Emma stopped humming all cheerfully in the kitchen, and the kids didn't really want to play outside anymore. We locked the doors, checked the windows, and slept with the lights on, and I started keeping a gun in the bedside drawer just in case. The neighborhood stayed very quiet and nobody else was hurt, but I really couldn't shake the fear. Watching out the windows and the doors and that dark driveway out front, I wanted to protect my family, to make our home safe again in all the ways I'd failed the first time. But deep down, I knew that it would never feel the same. Paradise was gone, and all we had left were the memories and that endless fear. Me and my missus are writing to you today to tell you about an absolutely messed up trip to the United Kingdom that we took a few years ago. It was just after COVID travel restrictions had been lifted, so we were itching to stretch our legs and visit a foreign country, so we picked somewhere as far away from home as possible. We didn't really have a plan for our UK holiday. It seemed like a nice place, so we opened up a map of Britain, stuck it on the dartboard at the bar that I co-own with my brother, and I threw a dart at it. Well, we missed, and I would have had to vacation in the Bristol Channel, so we threw another one and landed on Sussex. We didn't know anything about Sussex, and apparently it's not really a massive tourist destination, but we picked the funniest sounding place that also seemed a bit touristy, Bognor Regis. We figured if it was crap, it wouldn't be too hard to shoot up to London early, which we planned to do for the second half of the holiday regardless. Bognor Regis was actually great. We hit the town in July, dead in the middle of the Australian winter, and despite what we'd heard about the UK, the weather was bonzer. Me and the missus spent our days sunbathing on the beach, buying crap from the seafront stores and getting sunburnt. Then, at night, we hit the bars and the clubs and tried our best to paint the quiet seaside town red. We made a bunch of friends at Bognor Regis, other tourists from all over the world, like Detroit, Belgium, Turkey, Birmingham, all sorts. One fella that we met, he said his name was Rishi, like the then Prime Minister, which we all found really funny. Rishi was a wild party animal, and it was with Rishi that we got so drunk one night that we found ourselves lost in the middle of the countryside, unsure how to get back to Bognor Regis. Me and the missus were both absolutely wrecked, and we lost track of Rishi altogether. We were out in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how we'd even managed to get there. I have a vague memory of riding in a van with Rishi and some other guys drinking cheap beer, but now me and the missus were walking along a country road in the dark, singing God Save the Queen. Rest in peace, Liz. Eventually, we came across a 24-hour petrol station and a service station. There was a Costa Coffee, but it was closed, and a McDonald's staffed by a very bored-looking teenage boy. We bought some munchies and then wandered to the gas station to see if they had the number for a local taxi firm or some type of ride. The guy at the counter directed us to a notice board, which we struggled to read in our drunken state, but eventually found a business card from someone offering taxi services 24 hours a day. I called it up on my mobile, and a very polite young woman answered. I told her where we were at, described the service station, and she said that she knew exactly where to send a driver. She told us to look out for a silver Ford and that our driver would be named Mears. Half an hour later, a car pulled into the petrol station lot, and a shifty-looking bloke gestured us over. I asked if he was Mears, and he said, sure, why not? Now, looking back, I can't be sure if we got into the right car. It's hard to get it clear in my head whether I'm just remembering things wrong or whether we really were this careless with getting into a car with a stranger. Either way, Mears, or whoever this crooked bogan was, did not have our best interests at heart. It wasn't immediately obvious. We had no bloody clue where we were, so we had no bloody clue that Mears was driving us in the total opposite direction to Bognor Regis. And by now, my missus had passed out and was snoring against my shoulder. I tried to make conversation with Mears from the back seat, but he suddenly pretended that he couldn't speak English. Weird, I thought. He'd understood me perfectly earlier. Or maybe I'd been so drunk that I just sort of slurred nonsense at him and he just sort of gone along with it. When we pulled up to a stop, I knew we definitely weren't in Bognor Regis. We were in the courtyard of some broken-down, filthy farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I saw a chicken run across the dirt in the darkness and at least one goat peering at me eerily from beyond a fence. Lovely, I thought. Mears got out of the car and yelled something into the darkness. A dog began to bark furiously and a male voice called back. I peered through the front windscreen from the back seat, squinting into the darkness, and saw two fellas join Mears. Mears had his window down so I could hear them, even though I don't think he knew that I could hear them. Fear gripped me as I realized what they were talking about. Mears was saying that we were rich American tourists. We're Australians, you wanker, I wanted to yell, and that nobody knew where we were, so they could just do us over and dump us in the acid vats out back. Bloody Nora, I thought. I didn't much fancy that either. And neither did one of the men, because he vehemently disagreed with Mears, slapping him around on the back of the head even. And at first I thought this meant Mears had been kidding around. But no. The other man said that they just wanted to do me in, but the missus should be handed over to Osama and his boys, and they'd know what to do with her. I swear on my old dad's grave, when I heard Osama, I thought that they were just larrikins. But then Mears said something like, sure, maybe they'll hook us up with some of their fine, and then a derogatory term that implied that he was talking about very young women. Next, I saw the glint of steel as one of the men unsheathed some huge blade. Right, this could totally ruck off. Machetes, grooming gangs, a matey called Osama? Not bloody likely. Not for me and the missus. And I didn't even think. Drunk as an absolute skunk, I clambered into the front of the Ford Escort. The Lord God above must have been looking out for me that night, because Mears the moron had left his freaking keys in the ignition. For a second, I thought I was going to have a classic horror movie moment where the engine wouldn't take over and the car wouldn't start. But nah, luck was on my side. I gunned the engine and drove straight forward, even clipping Mears in the leg as he dived out of the way. Somehow, despite being a terrible driver even when sober, I managed to pull off a perfect U-turn and then send the car squealing, crashing out of the gate of the farmyard and onto the darkened country roads. I pushed that battered old Ford Escort to its absolute peak, breaking the speed limit for a good 20 minutes, hoping and praying that I'd encountered the law so they could pull me over and I could tell them everything. Eventually, I remembered the missus in the back. The lucky bird had slept through the entire thing and only now just started stirring, muttering and asking where we were and then telling me to slow down. Eventually, we found our way to a little village which had a 24-hour Tesco. Both our phones had run out of battery at some point in the night, so we went inside, and I told the poor old dear on the checkout that we'd almost been kidnapped by a grooming gang and could we possibly borrow the phone. I'd sobered up quite a bit by now, and I imagined I was still a total mess, and the missus was still rat-arsed. Now, long story short, the cops came, they searched some farmhouses in the area that could match the description I gave, but they didn't find anyone. And the car that we'd acquired had stolen plates and had been reported stolen a few years before. The cops impounded it, and for all I know, it's still in some impound lot today. The name Mears was apparently the name of a local taxi driver and had not been the guy whose car we'd gotten into. They were able to verify that the real Mears showed up at the petrol station shortly after we got into the wrong Ford. The cops did confirm one chilling fact, though. Osama was the first name of a suspect in a grooming gang case in the area. Unfortunately, our testimony didn't really help anything with that case, but I hope to God they got him. Me and the missus got off pretty lightly, all told. I still have friends who to this day insist that I got so drunk I imagined this whole thing, but I have copies of the police reports as a souvenir from our time in Bognor Regis to prove it. And I can only wish total ill will upon the men who intended to kill us, especially fake Mears. I hope it hurt when I hit you with your own car, and if you ever come to Australia, I'll happily feed you to a kangaroo, you tosser. Back in the 2000s, I went on a girls' trip to Crete. For the most part, it was absolutely awesome, especially for a history nerd like me. I loved exploring all the ruins, taking in the local history, and hanging out on the beach. And unlike at home, it was totally fine to sunbathe topless, so my pale ass didn't have to end up with an awful tan line like I usually did on vacation. In theory, anyway. Of course, I was actually way too shy to do that, but it was nice to know that I could have if I wanted to. I mention this because it's irrelevant that I'm kind of a wallflower. I don't really like being the center of attention or doing any wild things. I'm not a party girl, never have been. At the time of this vacation, I was just out of college and I'd still never even been drunk. I drank a glass of wine or two with dinner, but that was the extent of it. I was much more at home among the ancient stones of Greece than I was in the clubs, even if that was the main purpose of this holiday. I was the sensible one of the group, the designated driver, the sober Sally, and I was okay with this. I'd still go out on the town with the other girls, but I'd be the one to head back to the hotel by 10 p.m. and then awake to see the sunrise. All this to say, when I went to some Cretan ruins with one of my friends, Nora, and we met a couple of local brothers who offered us something to drink, I made them swear on Zeus that it wasn't alcoholic. For one thing, it was early afternoon. For another, I wanted to keep a clear head on because I was planning on exploring some subterranean tunnels in the ruins, and they weren't entirely safe. We'd met the boys in the town the night before, and they had construction permits for the area which wasn't entirely open to the public. They assured me that the bitter purple drink was a local recipe, a natural energy drink made from dandelions and other plants. At any other time, I would not accept strange drinks from strange men, but we were also accompanied by the brothers' grandparents and a sweet and lovely old couple who also assured me that the drink was not alcoholic and would simply give me the energy and drive to explore the ruins. Obviously, it's clear from the setup that there was something wrong with the drink, but to this day I'm certain that the family didn't intend there to be anything wrong with it. They just didn't consider the fact that their beloved family recipe might require a bit of acclimatization for an American tourist who isn't used to drinking something that contains datura. For those who don't know, datura is a somewhat poisonous plant that can be used as a recreational hallucinogen. Later, the family told me that they only used a pinch of datura in their drink to give it a kick, but I barely even drank wine, let alone hallucinogens or poison. On top of that, I was unknowingly suffering from mild sunstroke. I'd spent all morning in the sun at the ruins, and I'd mostly only been drinking this bitter dandelion and datura juice, so I was sunstruck and absolutely dehydrated. All of this was a recipe for disaster when I went down into the tunnels under the ruins, armed only with a flashlight, and decided that I could absolutely manage it alone. It didn't take long for me to start panicking. It was cooler underground, but there were strange sounds. Soon I'd lost sight of any natural sunlight and only had my flashlight to guide me. I started sensing something was wrong soon after that. Whorls and chips in the rock began to form words and pictures in the darkness. I paused for 5 entire minutes, reading some ancient writing on the wall that suddenly turned back into meaningless rock texture. And next, I was certain that I could feel hot animal breath on my neck. I spun around, and of course nothing was there. Somehow, I got it into my mind that the ghost of a minotaur was down here with me, an invisible minotaur ghost, and I began to run down the corridors, as if that would somehow help if it was in fact a ghost. I ended up just getting myself more lost and then heard scraping and the skittering of small stones. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, and a small minotaur with a hairy face was standing there. At least, that's what I saw him as in my sunstroke-addled datura-brained state. The minotaur began to advance towards me, snorting and growling at me. A voice in the back of my mind was telling me that I was hallucinating. I couldn't possibly actually be seeing a minotaur. It was an invisible ghost minotaur after all. So I stood my ground and shone my flashlight at the creature and waited for it to pass through me and disappear. Instead, the minotaur reached out and grabbed me. Stinking, foul wine breath washed over me as the beast bore down on me. And for some reason, the minotaur wore a filthy fisherman's coat and fishing pants too, and he had gumboots on and a beard and a knitted cap and was also an old man. Yeah, this wasn't a minotaur. It was a hobo lurking around in the ruins, and now he had his hands on me. My head was spinning, and colors were flashing around the tunnel like I was in a magic abyss. The hobo minotaur clacked his teeth at me and slobbered down his beard, and I felt him grabbing at the waistband of my pants. Hell no, buddy. I raised the flashlight up over my head and brought it down on his forehead with a crack. This caused this hobo minotaur to howl in enraged pain and let go of me, but it also caused the flashlight's beam to weaken quite considerably. I shoved the hobo roughly against a wall and ran past him, trying to follow the route that I was sure that I'd taken. And it was a chase sequence worthy of an actual slasher movie, not least because the hobo managed to grab me a couple of times and tear my shirt a bit. Thankfully, nothing revealing, and I would have been mortified, as we've already established. It was just enough to make me look kind of badass when I came running out of the tunnels, screaming that I was being chased by a freaking minotaur. And holy crap, someone call Olympus because there was an actual monster after me. Nora grabbed me and shook me and asked me what was really wrong. Nora had been drinking the Datura drink too, but didn't seem to be affected by it in the same way I was, maybe because she was used to alcohol and also didn't have sunstroke. I tried to explain that there was a beast, but then the hobo came charging out of the tunnel screaming and yelling. Later, our Greek friends wouldn't translate exactly what he'd said, but told me that it was obscene. The hobo rushed at me and grabbed me, throwing me to the ground and flipping me over. Nora punched him and I kicked, squabbling backwards away from him as he reeled back. The Greek guys we were with came running over and one of them grabbed the hobo and threw him backwards. He stumbled across the area, hitting a pillar hard with his arm. Some debris dislodged from the top of the pillar and fell straight onto his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. I heard an absolute sickening crunch of bone as the rock pinned him down, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for him, until I remembered what he'd clearly been trying to do to me in those tunnels. The elderly couple told the grandsons to take us back to our hotel, and that they'd call the cops and get the hobo arrested for trespassing. They said it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't... That said, it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't want the hobo to get away with assaulting me, I was still very dizzy and confused from whatever was affecting me, and also judging from the state of the hobo and his crushed arm, he wouldn't be trying to assault anyone else anytime soon. I slept off the heat exhaustion and datura poisoning, and the next day we had a conversation with these Greek brothers in which we worked out that the datura in the cocktail was the likely culprit for my hallucinations, if you haven't already figured it out. And in some ways, I think their strange concoction actually helped. It gave me the energy to fight back against this hobo and escape through the tunnels, and maybe if I'd been faced with the dark reality of the situation down in those ruins, I might have fallen apart and been unable to escape. On the other hand, maybe if I wasn't high on datura and actually had heat stroke, I might not have gone into a labyrinth alone in the first place. But really, who can say? I've got a story about Canada that I want to share with you. My family and I are from Kentucky. There's me, my wife Ellie, my 20-year-old daughter, my 15-year-old son, and my 9-year-old daughter. We go on vacation to Europe most years, but last year we decided that it was finally time to get really exotic and head to Canada. We settled in a small village near the boreal forest and went about researching the perfect Airbnb to rent for a week of wilderness tranquility and enjoyment. My wife found the perfect place, very affordable too, and we booked it. A few months later, I headed up to Merry Canada with the fam in tow. My son Elijah spent the entire journey playing on his Switch and wouldn't pay attention to the beautiful natural countryside, but my wife and daughters were awestruck, and so was I. I hadn't been to Canada in many years and was bringing back a lot of fond memories. We arrived at the Airbnb, a stunning woodland property just off from the nearby village. The key was meant to be just inside this digital lockbox attached to the front of the house, but as we pulled up and got out, it was pretty clear that the box was hanging open. Great start. I tried the front door and it was locked, of course. Well, No problem. Thankfully, there was cell reception at the property, so I called up the number that we had for the owners, but no answer. Great again. Seconds later, we heard footsteps crunching under the driveway. An elderly couple waved to us and asked if we'd been calling them. They introduced themselves as the owners of the property and apologized if they were running late. They had the key with them and they could let us right on in. They were an odd-looking pair, I guess. The husband introduced himself as an ex-cop in his 70s, and he reminded me of one of the sort of Weeble toys from when I was a kid. Weeble wobbles, but won't fall down, you know the ones? He was completely hairless, like shiny bald and free of eyebrows, but he had a huge bushy beard that I kept staring at because I was certain it was a wig. Is that what you call a fake beard? To this day I don't even know, and the icing on the cake was his name. He said his name was Gerald Garibaldi, and I began to laugh when he said this, but my wife kinda elbowed me and Gerald Garibaldi looked slightly excited as if he had no idea what the joke was. And the wife introduced herself as Maureen Garibaldi, and the hair on her face wasn't a wig. It was unfortunate, but Maureen Garibaldi had a few thick whiskers sprouting from her chin and a very prominent female mustache that looked like it hadn't been waxed since pretty much ever. Not that she had any obligation to actually wax, of course, but needless to say that they were a very odd-looking couple. My eldest, Cindy, and Elliot were elbowing each other, sort of whispering and laughing, and it was all I could do to keep a straight face when my youngest, Amy, kept asking what was so funny. Maureen was in her 60s and wore a flowery summer dress that was kind of obscenely short. She had long white socks on and those black shiny shoes that honest to God schoolgirls wear, and I'm ashamed to say that the pair of them kind of unsettled me. Gerald and Maureen Garibaldi led us into the house and then very kindly gave us a tour that somehow managed to last nearly 2 hours. Then they very kindly helped us bring our luggage in from the car, and then kindly helped us unpack the kitchen things and food and other essentials, and then kindly sat there like eager puppies, clearly waiting for us to invite them to stay for dinner. It was the first night of our freaking vacation though, and I really didn't want those weirdos encroaching on our family time, but hey, what could I do? They were very kind. And that phrase became a running joke because the Garibaldis continuously told us that we were very kind for this and that thing. Over dinner, Gerald Garibaldi talked and talked and talked, and the rest of us could just do nothing but listen. And the crazy thing is, I couldn't really tell you what he talked about. He just rambled about nothing and everything. Politics, movies, music, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, cancel culture, the youth of today, animated violence, and those damn video games. All sorts of stuff. But I could not tell you a single thing he actually said or a single opinion he actually had. It was like the man was talking total gibberish, just saying snippets of things that made some sense or could pertain to something, but just didn't really fit together in any cohesive manner. And at one point he was talking about how Trump was the worst thing to happen to the country in years, but then 5 seconds later he was calling him the greatest damn president the country's ever seen. He kept bringing up Angela Merkel too, saying what an ugly troll she was, and Ellie and I fought to keep a straight face because I swear up and down Maureen Garibaldi could have been Angela Merkel's long-lost twin, separated at birth. Now imagine Angela Merkel dressed like a Lolita, I was told, and deepest apologies for the image, but that was Maureen Garibaldi, and don't ask me how I know any of that stuff. They were honestly like something from that weird show on TLC. I genuinely wanted to look around for hidden cameras. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely we were being pranked. Unfortunately, things didn't stay comical for very long. After dinner, the Garibaldis made themselves comfortable in the living room and turned the TV on. I took Ellie into the other room and asked her what the hell we were going to do. Amy was almost crying because she wanted to play board games, and Elliot and Cindy had already left to explore the outskirts of the forest before the sun had fully set. In the end, I had to very politely ask the Garibaldis if they would mind leaving for the night and letting us settle in. I expected them to display that Canadian embarrassment and a sort of aw shucks energy, but instead, Gerald Garibaldi decided to square up to me. He pushed me in the chest and accused me of being an ungrateful guest. They had allowed us into their abode after all, And how dare we simply ask them to leave? What right did I have to try and throw a man out of his own home, especially after dinner? It started to dawn on me that these freaks did not realize how Airbnb was supposed to work. I mean, surely they realized that they were meant to leave the house while we stayed in it. And I gently tried to ask this, and they acted furious. Again, I almost thought that we were being pranked. Maybe this was one of those dumb YouTube things. But then Maureen began outright howling and crying and accusing us of being home invaders. I could not believe what I was hearing. When she threw some pretty vile slurs at Ellie, that's when I knew that this was definitely not a joke. I drew the line there. This had been funny for an evening, but it was beginning to ruin our much-needed vacation. And moreover, they were upsetting Amy, and nobody speaks to my wife like that. I have no idea, but demand that this couple leave their own property or I'd call the police. I wasn't even sure if this could fly legally, but what choice did I have? I could put a complaint in the Airbnb the next day, and if we had to find a nice hotel in the town over, then that would suck, but so be it. Surprisingly, the Garibaldis seemed terrified at the idea of me calling the cops. They heaved their considerable bulks off the couch and stormed out. Now I watched them leave, stamping their way around the outside of the house and into the forest. Now minutes later, Elliot came back in. I filled him in on what he'd missed and told him that the Garibaldis were unhinged and not to let them in if they came back. Elliot agreed and then asked where Cindy was. My heart sank. I thought she'd been with him. Elliot said she had been, but that she'd headed back to the house ahead of him because she needed to use the bathroom. Ellie was upstairs putting Amy to bed, so Elliot and I rushed outside to try and find Cindy. She was in a clearing with the Garibaldis. As I approached, I saw that Maureen was holding a damn shovel. As I got closer, I could hear what Gerald was saying. He was trying to persuade my 20-year-old daughter to come back with them to their house and have some sexy times with them. Cindy, who hadn't been present during the blow-up, was doing her best to be nice and not offend them, and I'm so proud of her for that. She was clearly worried about the shovel Maureen was holding, though, despite not knowing how volatile and weird this couple really was. I snuck out behind Maureen and grabbed the shovel from her hands. I told Cindy to get behind me, and that she didn't have to put up with this crap from these utter freaks. Maureen screamed at me, telling me that my family wasn't safe, and that they booby-trapped the house, and that there was a carbon monoxide leak that would poison us all in our sleep, and that they'd rigged the house to kill us. It was absolutely insane. I had no idea what we could do. There was no way that we could stay overnight in that house when the owners were this nuts. For the moment, I told Cindy to take Elliot back into the house. Then I kind of threatened the Garibaldis with a shovel, making sure they backed off and left the property. Once I was sure they waddled far enough away, I went back into the house. Inside, Ellie met me with some incredibly bizarre news. While I'd been out there dealing with the Garibaldis, she'd received a phone call on the Airbnb's landline. It was the owners, asking if we'd arrived okay and calling to wish us a pleasant stay. Of course, Ellie had told them that we'd spent an evening with the supposed owners, and my wife described the couple who'd intruded on our Canadian vacation. The actual owners, the McAvoys, told us to keep the door locked and that they'd be over with law enforcement shortly. Now, sure enough, 10 minutes later, a station wagon and a police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and that's how we met the real and very lovely owners of that Airbnb. There's a simple, if crazy, explanation for what had happened. The Garibaldis, which was not their real name, of course, were the neighbors of the McAvoys who'd been enraged on a land boundary dispute with them for years. They'd always been quietly resentful of the McAvoys, and always been an annoying but minor thorn in their side. When the McAvoys bought a second property on the other side of the Garibaldis' land, it all became too much for them, and they decided to try and sabotage the McAvoys' attempts at earning income through Airbnb by masquerading as the owners, the lunatic Garibaldis, to scare away any guests. Turns out, we were the first guests, and the Garibaldis' bizarre, grudge-driven plan almost worked. The utter weirdos had even managed to spy on the McAvoys to see the keypad code for the electronic lock and help themselves to the key. Unfortunately, that was the only real crime they'd committed, and even then it was their word against the McAvoys that they hadn't actually been told the key code. However, the Garibaldis, whose real names I won't use just in case, were known as menaces and troublemakers to local law enforcement, who were only too happy to put the scares on them enough that we had a mostly peaceful stay for the rest of our vacation. Which, I will add, the McAvoys gave us a severe discount on, meaning that for the most part, we got to spend a beautiful, tranquil vacation on the outskirts of the boreal forest for half the normal asking price. I say for the most part because there was one final scary incident before we left. On the day we were packing up to head out, after having had a great time, I was downstairs with Cindy packing up the kitchen. We heard a crash from the living room and ran next door to see that a stone had been hurled through the windows, smeared with what I can only hope was mud. We rushed outside to see a fat figure disappearing into the trees. I let the McAvoys know, and they informed the cops. I really hope for their sake that they installed some home security going forward. I do keep an eye on the Airbnb website to see if that property's ever been made available to vacationers again, and I've not seen it crop up since. It could be that the McAvoys decided that it wasn't worth trying to combat the Garibaldis, or it could just be that they're not renting through Airbnb anymore. Either way, I wish the McAvoys all the best. As for the bizarre, creepy couple, if you've ever come near my family again, I'll show you us US folk aren't quite as forgiving as our Canadian cousins. My name's Rachel, I'm from New York, and I see that you post a lot of hiking and camping stories, so I figured I'd send mine in. I used to do a lot of solo hiking in my early 20s, something I picked up in college and then carried with me into the real world. It was my #1 stress reliever and my chosen method of exercise, but that all changed after a trip to the Catskills, one that ended up being the last solo hiking trip I ever went on. I went to college in Pennsylvania, so while I'd visited a lot of the trails and parks over there, my native New York remained mostly unexplored. That meant my trip to the Catskills in November of 2017, specifically to a place called Blackthorn Ridge, was my first. I enjoyed the exercise aspect of hiking, but sometimes it was the solitude I craved the most, and I'd sometimes shy away from the more pedestrian trails in order to see the less traveled areas of the places I visited. So you can imagine my surprise when, while working through a patch of pine trees, I saw a small leather-bound object sitting at the base of a tree. Being the naturally curious soul that I am, I walked over and picked it up. And while it had obviously been there for a long time, I found that it was in relatively good condition. It was a small leather-bound notebook, and then when I opened it up, I saw it was actually somebody's journal. It felt a little rude and obviously intrusive at first, just kind of reading someone's journal like that. But since the notes seemed to focus on the details of the writer's hike, I figured it wouldn't hurt if I just sort of thumbed through it a little, especially if it meant being able to return their journal to them once I got back home. The first entries I read were pretty ordinary, and mostly talked about being on a winding path through a place called Blackthorn Ridge, which coincidentally was pretty much exactly where I was standing. The notebook's owner was also a solo hiker, and obviously somewhat of a kindred spirit, I guess, because they wrote about the thrill of being out there alone, how beautiful and peaceful it was, and how it was their first time in the area. It was like reading my own story, all written out ahead of time, and I remember thinking how me and this person would probably be good friends should we ever meet one day. I closed the journal, slid it into my jacket pocket, and then carried on hiking along the ridge till I felt the pang of hunger creeping up on me. I stopped near some flat rocks, took out my water bottle and a few snacks, And then as I sat cross-legged on one of the rocks, I just kept reading the journal. I'd already made a note of the person's name, as there was a little note saying, "If lost, please return to X," so I knew exactly where to mail it to once I got back home. But since I was lacking on any reading material, and this person's hiking journal was so relevant, I figured that I'd just keep reading on a little until things got too personal. But things didn't get personal, they just got weird. I remember turning a page and then seeing how the next entry was written way different than the others. Now, in short, it was just clipped sentences. The person wrote about how the woods didn't feel so friendly anymore. They wrote how the birds weren't singing anymore, and how the squirrels weren't coming down from the trees. But obviously not like I'm doing. All they wrote was, "No birds, no critters, dead quiet." The next words were, "Predator in area?" It seemed very rushed. So I immediately glanced up and started scanning the trees around me, but I didn't get the same impression at all. To me, and I was a pretty experienced hiker at the time, everything seemed fine. The birds were sound, the squirrels were bounding around the forest floor, I could kind of hear them, and I didn't even feel remotely under that threat or in danger. But then, as I read on, I got this creeping feeling up my spine, as the hiker's final entry mentioned a place called Hollow Crag. They said that there was this rocky clearing just beyond a meadow where the grass dropped into a shallow basin. All they wrote after that was something like, "Warn any other hikers, stay away." They didn't explain what that exact danger was, they only warned against going there. But those final few words about warning other hikers, about staying away, they looked almost scratched into the page, like whoever had written it was scared out of their minds. I remember closing the journal over and tucking it back into my jacket, and with that creeping feeling working its way up my spine. Not because I feel like I was being watched or anything, or my spidey sense was tingling or anything woo-woo like that. It was because Hollow Crag was on my list of actual destinations that day. I had marked it on my map as one of 5 checkpoints, in an oval-shaped route that'd take me all the way up Blackthorn Ridge and back again. It was supposed to serve as my more than halfway now checkpoint, so unless I wanted to dramatically delay my return home by adding 2 or 3 hours to my journey, I had to pass by Hollow Crag to stay on schedule. I could skirt around it, but I couldn't avoid it, and at the time that seemed like it'd be enough. But looking back on it, I should have just swallowed the loss and resigned myself to hiking the extra hours, because when that journal said to stay away from Hollow Crag, it should have really said, avoid it at all costs. I got myself back on the trail so I could better navigate the area, but seeing how far out I was, it was barely any clearer than the terrain on either side of it. Roots were creeping under the soil, and low-hanging branches made it so I had to stoop down while paying extra attention to my footing. I should have been getting pretty tired at that point. I'd been hiking solidly for a few hours, but I was also getting a nice steady hit of adrenaline every time I thought about what was written in that journal. I'd glance over my shoulder every so often, half expecting to see someone following me, but the forest seemed empty, just me and the trees. There was no one in sight, but that didn't mean no one was there, and I remember the moment I heard this loud snap coming from behind me. It sounded like a big branch being ripped from a tree with a ton of force, like this sharp, tearing snap of wood. It sounded like it was maybe 50 yards back, but I didn't stop for a better guess, I guess, and I kept moving, thinking to myself, it's behind you, not ahead of you. You're safe for now. Just keep beating feet. And I started moving a little faster, risking a fall to put some distance between me and whoever made that noise. I kept my ears open for any other sounds too, but aside from my own breathing and footsteps, there was nothing. I knew I should have looked back, just to make sure that it was clear, but I couldn't. I guess there's a part of me that was still pretending it was all just in my head, so I couldn't bring myself to look back. I just kept moving steadily toward a curve in the trail, knowing I'd need to conserve every last ounce of energy if I was going to make a run for it. I sped up a little as I took the curve, but as I reached its end, I found myself faced with thinning trees and a large expanse of open grass. There was a wide, shallow bowl of rock and sparse grass, just as the person's hiking journal had described. It was hollow crag, and there was no getting around it. It's not like I wanted to step out into the open, but doubling back meant facing whoever was behind me, so I did the only thing I could and started to cross it. As I walked, my eyes darted toward every flicker of movement as my heart rate began to skyrocket from the terror of being so exposed. Once again, it seemed like I was alone, as I couldn't see anything but grass and tree trunks on the other side of the crag. But I knew that was impossible. I knew there was someone following me. And while I was alone, they weren't. I remember finally being brave enough to turn around and check behind me, but my head only made it 90 degrees before I saw the second guy off to my left. There was some type of figure walking at the far edge of the crag, one that moved out of the tree line and out into the afternoon sun in the moments after I spotted him. He was tall, strong-looking, and had the confidence of an outdoorsman about him, but I could tell right away he was no hiker. His clothes were very wrong. They were tattered, mismatched, like he'd pieced them together from scraps of men and women's clothing. He stopped as soon as he saw me, and I mean it very literally when I say that I felt his eyes on me. All I could do was clutch the straps of my pack and start walking faster, aiming for the trail on the other side. I had hoped that he'd stay where he was, but he didn't. He followed. The second man slipped back into the tree line again, probably in the hopes that I hadn't spotted him right away. Then he moved parallel to me, mirroring my movements as I pushed towards the trail. At this point, my legs were burning from the exertion, and I wasn't even running yet. I knew that, like any predator, running would be the trigger for them to chase me. And when that chase started, it needed to start on my terms, not theirs. The trail was close now, maybe 30 to 40 yards, but I could still see the second man keeping pace to my left, ready to swoop in at any moment. I didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but the journal's warning screamed in my mind, and I knew I had to move faster. I reached the trail and broke into a jog. Then when I heard a gruff voice behind me yell, "She's getting away!" I burst into a sprint. Even with low branches scratching at my face, and even with my pack bounced painfully against my back, I ran as fast and as far as my legs could carry me, because I'd never been so scared in my entire life in those moments. I needed as much distance between us as possible, but moving faster meant the risk of losing my footing, and unfortunately for me, it didn't take long for that to happen. I remember stumbling over a root and only barely catching myself against a tree, pushing off with my hands that were already scraped and bleeding, and then kept running as my legs and lungs were still burning. I had a nice clear patch at one point, a stretch that I could really get my legs pumping, but it didn't last. The trail suddenly twisted downhill, and while that meant that I was making progress, it also meant that I nearly lost my feet again. That time, I was even luckier not to go tumbling down that slope, which at that stage probably could have been fatal. So, in an attempt to stay on more stable ground, I veered off the trail and into the undergrowth, hoping that might help me lose these men chasing me. I don't know how long I ran, but I was at my absolute limit when I finally stopped for what could only be a short break. I was huffing air. My vision was all dizzy as the forest blurred around me, and I fought the urge to puke. My legs obviously were screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, even if the only thing keeping me going was pure terror. I ran until the forest began to thin out and the trees gave way to a gravel path. I followed it, practically staggering from the exhaustion, until I saw a ranger station, a small wooden building with a green door. The relief was overwhelming, so strong that tears started to fill my eyes as my legs felt like they were literally going to give out. I climbed the steps and pounded on that door. No one answered, but the door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. And like any good traumatic event, I got to enjoy a wonderfully horrifying moment of a false ending. Because when I walked inside, I saw that that station was empty. There was no ranger, just a single room with a desk, a radio, and a map of the Catskills pinned to the wall. I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, keeping my back against it as one final line of defense against anyone that might have followed me. When I heard nothing but silence for what must have been a half hour or so, I took the journal from my jacket and placed it on the ranger's desk. I don't know why I did that at first, but now looking back on it, it feels like I was saying, okay, no more. I give up and I don't want to play anymore. I know it was superstitious, but the sun was already setting when I arrived at the ranger station, and by the time I felt sturdy enough to walk again, it was almost full dark outside. I knew it'd be incredibly stupid to head back out into the woods, so I just stayed there until morning, too afraid to move. And when the sun finally rose up, and there was just enough light coming through the station's small window for me to see, I forced myself to stand again. My body was aching from the previous day, but it was either get on the move or stay there with no food or water for another night. I left the journal on the desk. I didn't want or need it anymore, and besides, the ranger needed to read it a hell of a lot more than I did, I think. And when I stepped outside, the forest was so much more quiet and peaceful than the previous evening that it was like being in a different place altogether. Then, after walking for some time down a large trail, I heard a truck. At first I was about to run, but when I saw the ranger decal, I started frantically flagging them down. The truck stopped and the ranger got out looking startled till I assured him that everything was fine. At least, by then it was fine anyway. I told him about the men near Hollow Crag, how on their own it had been frightening, but coupled with what was in that journal, my mind was spinning and I'd been absolutely scared beyond all comprehension to be up there alone with those weirdos. I didn't know what kind of a reaction I was really expecting, but I definitely wasn't expecting the ranger to just sort of sigh, like it was a pretty regular annoyance for him. Now for me, getting chased off of that area was one of the most terrifying experiences of my whole life, but to the ranger, that was the third time it had happened that year. He laid it out for me as he gave me a ride back to the trailhead. The rangers didn't know much about the men who lived up there, only that they were aggressive and didn't like people passing through. The only attempt to communicate with them had resulted in a warning shot from some kind of bow, one that resulted in an arrow slamming into a tree right close to the ranger's head. So rather than risk a full-blown Ruby Ridge rerun, the rangers decided to just close the trail off and leave them be. That's half the reason it was so overgrown. But the two men up there took down any closed trail signs that rangers tried to put up, which is why I didn't see any heading in. I remember asking the ranger why they'd take the signs down if they didn't want anyone near Hollow Crag there, and he said that he didn't know exactly, but his guess was they hated everything associated with the federal government, cheap plastic signs included. It was a major shock hearing it all like that, and learning so casually that they were just sort of these wild people living up in the mountains and that the government was basically like, okay, whatever, I guess. And that's what really drove it home for me that America is still a wild country, and it's wild in more ways than one. People think of the city as a dangerous place and the country as safe, but that trip to the Catskills made me realize just how wrong that is. Some people are out there far from civilization, living by nobody's rules but their own. And while on paper that might sound cool, the reality can be horrifying for those who actually cross their paths. This might sound crazy, but I somehow made it being a 28-year-old father of one without ever once going on a camping trip. And when my friend Caleb found out, he just about blew a gasket. He's a real Bass Pro Shop is my personality kind of guy, and the only person I ever knew who played hunting games on his Xbox. He hadn't been hunting in years, but he'd used to do a ton of camping weekends with the National Guard, and he figured that there was no better buddy bonding method than heading out into the boonies together. So since we were in Buffalo at the time, He said the Catskills were probably the best place to go if we wanted to get as wild as possible while staying close to home. We packed light, drove up in his beat-up truck, and then set out into the woods and found a spot a couple of miles from the trailhead. I had to admit, Caleb had picked out a real nice spot. It was nestled into a small clearing surrounded by pines and maples, and the ground was soft with fallen pine needles, so even without the camping chairs, it made for a good seat, and with a stream gurgling nearby, we had ourselves a supply of fresh water too. Caleb volunteered to set up both tents, so I occupied myself collecting firewood. It felt pretty cool, doing something useful that had contributed to building an actual fire, and as kind of a fire bug during my youth, getting to make a big one was something that I was actually very excited about. And by the time we had it crackling, the night had settled in and Caleb was showing off some of the campfire cooking he'd learned in the Guard. He'd made these things called pudgy pies, which are basically a ton of peanut butter and marshmallow fluff between two pieces of half-stale bread. That might not sound like anything special, but my God, out there in the woods, with the chill of the night setting in, it was one of the best things I've ever had the pleasure of eating. But as we ate, the fire burned down fast, and it wasn't long before we needed to collect more firewood. I volunteered myself, seeing as Caleb had brought all the food on his own dime, and then after getting up from my camping chair, I headed off into the darkness. I'd pretty much cleared the area around the camp, so I had to walk into the trees with my flashlight to find more decently sized pieces. I walked around, stacking pieces in the crook of my arm, and then, all of a sudden, I heard something moving in the darkness ahead of me. I stopped dead and pointed my flashlight ahead of me, expecting to see a deer or something weird, some kind of woodland creature, but there was nothing. Now I called back. "Yo, Caleb, I think there's something out here." To which then he replied, "Yeah, of course there's something out there, buddy. It's the woods." And the way he said it had me instantly kind of relaxing, thinking, yeah, I mean, that little thing is probably more scared of me than I am of it. Then after picking up a few more chunks of logs, I made my way back to the camp. Once the fire was roaring again, Caleb cracked open the cooler and we had ourselves a few cold sodas while watching the flames like they were TV. I was just about finished with my soda, so this couldn't have been more than 15 minutes later, when me and Caleb heard another sound, closer to the camp this time. We both went quiet and turned our heads in the direction of the sound. Caleb yelled something like, "Hey, ain't nothing here for you, buddy. Just move along now." And he said it so confidently that I couldn't imagine anything but the hungriest black bear not listening to him. And then a second or two later, we heard these steady footsteps moving away from us. I remember being kind of impressed that it actually worked. I expected Caleb to be pretty pleased with himself, and he didn't look pleased with himself at all. He actually looked spooked. I asked him what was up, and I'll never forget the chill that went through me when he said, "That wasn't an animal, buddy. That was a person." I asked how he was sure, and he said the gait was unmistakable, as in like the rhythm of the footsteps told him it was walking on 2 legs and not 4, something I wasn't familiar with in the woods. I got up walking over to his pack and took out the little gun case that he kept his pistol in, and then after taking it out and loading it and tucking it into his jacket, he suggested that we go on a little walk to make sure the area was still clear, and maybe talk to whoever was out there. I'm not gonna lie, walking the woods with an armed man who said that he just wanted to talk to whoever was out there was pretty goddamned wild. That was Caleb. He's a friendly guy, but boy can he handle himself. He wasn't looking for a fight. Neither of us were about to lay our heads down to sleep without knowing that we were in the clear. Once we were sure the area was clear, we headed back to camp for what Caleb called a Mexican pizza. And then after a couple of beers and a pre-roll that I brought along for old time's sake, we climbed into our tents for some well-deserved sleep. But for me, sleep did not come easy. My little pine needle mattress flattened out within just a few minutes, and even with the sleeping pad that I had with me, the ground was uncomfortably hard to lay on. On top of that, I started hearing sounds outside the tent again. Not as close or rhythmic as the footsteps we'd heard, but enough to have my eyes shooting open every time I heard something a little too loud. I remember listening out for Caleb, thinking, he's got to hear this too, right? But then I suddenly heard him snoring softly in his tent. He was out cold. I lay there telling myself, if Caleb thinks it's safe enough to sleep, then it is. And then after sort of chuckling to myself and feeling like an idiot, I managed to get comfortable enough to feel like I was drifting off to sleep too. But then, I heard it. A distant noise that sounded almost like a faint cry of something alive and in pain. I remember trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or maybe an animal making perfectly normal animal sounds. But then I heard it again. It cut through the silence, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. It sounded almost like a baby crying, like a sharp and intensely disturbing sound that set my nerves on edge to hear it. I sat up, straining to listen while both hearing and feeling my heart rate pick up. Then I heard it a third time, and that time, it was completely unmistakable. It was a high-pitched sob that rose and fell with the baby's breath, and I'm sure you'll know what I mean when I say the sound alone tugged at something primal in me, something which said, make it stop. I rushed to put my boots on, then unzipped my tent and rushed over to Caleb's. I guess running woke him up because he asked, "What's going on?" before I even got to his tent. I unzipped it, just enough to be able to see him, and then said, "Shh, listen." We listened in silence for maybe only a second before it sounded again. That same skin-crawling baby's wail. Caleb's eyes went all wide as he pushed himself out of his sleeping bag, and the first thing he went for was his gun. I remember saying, "Bro, there's a kid. I don't think the gun is gonna help." Because my first thought was like, there's a kid out there, lost and afraid, who actually needs our help. But then Caleb says, "That's no kid, buddy. Listen again." And I remember being just about to launch into some counterpoint, something along the lines of, "What the hell are you talking about?" But then the baby cried again, and I caught on to what he meant. There was something wrong with the sound we were hearing, something you didn't notice unless you really listened. The gut reaction I felt masked it, but Caleb was right. There was something off about it, something weirdly hollow. And before I could process it, another cry started, this one from the opposite direction to the first. It sounded identical, the exact same eerie wail as the first, only louder and closer. But then suddenly, the pitch shifted a little, and we realized what we were listening to. They were recordings. Now, I'd like to say that that was a relief, but as you can imagine, there was still the issue of who the F would play the sounds of crying babies in the woods at night. The thought obviously had Caleb going for his gun, and he told me to stay low as he crawled out of his tent and out into the night. He called out something oddly calm considering the circumstances. "All right, we get it, buddy. We'll move along in the morning." I figured that might make the noises stop, but instead, they only got louder. The recordings of those babies crying kept looping before a third, and then a fourth joined in. They sounded like they were all around us by then, like the whole forest was echoing with the sounds of wailing infants being played on a loop. They started overlapping, blending together as they seemed to get louder and closer. Caleb shouted over them, "They're just trying to scare us, buddy. And if they're not, I got a gun." He yelled it like he wanted them to hear too, whoever was out there playing those goddamned recordings. And then, all at once, the cry stopped. But the silence that followed was somehow even worse. We kept waiting for the sounds to start up again or for something terrible to happen, like an attack or gunshots or whatever these psychos out there had planned for us. I asked Caleb what the hell we should do, and all he said was leave. The fire had died down and I was about to grab my flashlight when Caleb told me not to. He said he needed our night vision to see what was out there and that flashlights would just make it easier for them to see us. But that meant trying to gather up all our essentials in the near pitch darkness. We took turns, one of us with the gun, the others packing our stuff. Then when Caleb emerged from his tent after being the second one to gather up his things, we made our move. We didn't speak as I followed him through the trees. We moved slowly, heads on a swivel, trying to spot whoever was out there before they spotted us. Caleb had the gun, our only line of defense between us and whatever was out there, and despite the night being pretty cold, I could feel myself sweating. My heart was racing as we pushed through the dark underbrush, and every few steps I thought I saw something. I didn't know if we were going to be attacked, chased, or if we were walking right into a trap and didn't even know it. Caleb said we were moving back towards the trail, which wasn't even that far, but it felt like it took forever to get there. In the darkness, the woods were disorienting, the trees all looking the same. When we finally broke through to the trailhead, the sight of Caleb's truck was a huge relief to the both of us. My hands were shaking real bad as I fumbled the door and climbed into the passenger seat. Caleb didn't hesitate in gunning the engine before we tore down the dirt road with the forest blurring past us. We drove a few miles until we spotted a diner's neon sign flickering in the darkness ahead. Caleb pulled in, killed the engine, and we sat there for a moment, still pretty shaken. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars and a delivery truck, so we figured that it was as safe a place as any to hang out until morning. Neither of us was going back out there to collect our gear until the sun was up. A few tense hours later, with neither of us being able to sleep, the diner opened up at 6 a.m. and we headed inside for some breakfast. A few early morning truckers filed in and at the counter as me and Caleb hunched over plates of eggs and bacon. We talked over what had happened in these whispered voices and agreed that someone was obviously trying to scare us off so they could steal whatever we'd left behind. I said something about kicking myself for not standing my ground if that's all they planned, scaring us off, I mean. Caleb said it was better we avoided violence, or we might have ended up in a jail cell instead of eating bacon. I remember looking at the other people in the diner, trying to read their faces. I wanted to ask if they'd heard anything, if they knew about the cries in the woods, but something stopped me. I then asked Caleb if they thought that they knew about what was going on out there, and he agreed they probably did. When we were done, I paid the bill and we stepped back into the parking lot. The drive back to where we'd been camped was a tense one. Then once we'd finished hiking back to the campsite, we found Caleb was right. Our tents had been ransacked. All of our food and beer was gone, along with pretty much everything else of value too. Whoever it was even took the poles out of my tent, and to this day I wonder what they planned on using them for if they didn't take the fabric along with them. Caleb's tent, which was much more expensive and roomy than mine, was gone entirely. And we didn't stick around. Not wanting to leave behind any of our crap, we tossed whatever hadn't been stolen from us onto the fabric of my tent, and then rolled it up and carried it back to the truck before we drove home. Then what happened became just another campfire tale, I guess. We did go camping again. Caleb and I went other places with mutual friends of ours tagging along, but we sure as hell didn't head out into the Catskills anymore. I can tell you that much. I have this traumatic childhood memory that I cannot forget. Sometimes I dream about it or just think about it late at night when I can't sleep and I'm feeling stressed. It sucks, and I thought maybe posting about it might help me get over it a little. So I'm sending this to you today, and when I was a kid, we were always struggling for money. I feel like we moved houses maybe 6 or 7 times, usually a downgrade to a much cheaper property, even a trailer one time, followed by a big upgrade because my dad never lived within our means. As soon as he had a bit of dough, we started spending it, living in luxury. It was kind of sweet. He wanted to provide for me, my mom, and my baby brother, but he just wasn't good at keeping hold of money. When he had a good job, we'd get takeout food every day, and he'd shower us with toys and mom with gifts. Then we'd lose everything and end up in some dirty-ass trailer park or something, and everyone would be stressed. Dad would never take it out on us, but he'd take it out on himself, smoking and drinking and falling into a stupor, so it took longer to break out of the rut and find the next job. I never really knew what my father did for work. He didn't have a profession exactly. He took on random jobs and schemes pretty much. He was always looking for his latest get-rich-quick gimmick, and if I'd try to list or even remember most of them, I'd probably be here all night. One time, he sold cigarettes out of the back of his car until the law shut him down. Another time, he got a group of parolee friends working as home decorators until a client realized that he didn't have the necessary licenses and insurance when one of the guys fell through the roof. It was just things like this, all the time, and while he was a fun dad, it also made my childhood incredibly stressful, especially after my baby brother Barton was born and wouldn't stop crying all the time. The specific memory that sticks in my mind happened when we were renting a fairly nice house in the suburbs. I guess Dad's latest scheme had been paying off because things had been going well for a while and I was beginning to let myself relax. I remember the sun was setting so that it must have been mid-evening when the knock on the door came. I knew my mom and dad were downstairs with Barton, so I was surprised when the knock sounded again and nobody answered. I looked out the window of my bedroom at the front of the house. A guy was standing at the door. He looked up at me and something about him terrified me. I know it's silly, but in my head I kind of equate him to that Rocksteady character from the Ninja Turtles. You know that big rhinoceros with a tank top, khaki pants, and big boots? This guy reminded me of him, only, human. He had this mullet that looked ex-army and an earring that kind of glinted in one ear and tattoos all up his thick, muscled arms. He must have caught sight of me looking at him because he looked up and kind of scowled at me from under a very thick, ugly unibrow. I know I'm probably imagining him as more troll-like and terrifying in my mind than he actually was, but I guess that's how childhood traumas kind of get at you, I guess. And now I'm going to call him Rocksteady, but he began hammering on the front door with a very meaty fist. He shouted that he knew we were home. He'd seen someone in the upstairs window. An instant terror and guilt flooded through me. Immediately, I heard footsteps downstairs, Dad going to the front door and Mom coming upstairs. My bedroom door opened just as I heard the front door unlatch. Mom was holding Barton, reassuring me that everything was okay and to come back into the room and play. I ignored her and ran to the window. Dad had stepped outside into the front yard with Rocksteady, and Rocksteady was sizing up Dad, looming over him very menacingly. And my dad wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a buff guy who worked out. He was fairly short, and in my mind, he was fragile. He was always smiling and joking and being silly, and the idea of someone like Rocksteady hurting him seemed like a genuine possibility. Even more so as I watched this guy grab Dad by his shirt and drag him into the street. I started to cry and bang on the window, but Mom came and pulled me away and made me play with Barton for a bit, even though inside I was absolutely breaking. After 5 minutes or so, Mom had to use the bathroom, so I darted to the window again. Dad and Rocksteady were in the street. Dad was pacing back and forth, gesturing and talking animatedly in his way, and Rockstar seemed calmer and was leaning up against a muscle car. I watched as Dad and Rockstar shook hands, and then Dad came back into the house. He was all smiles and cheery after that. Nothing to worry about, he said. Just a simple misunderstanding. Rocksteady was a guy he worked with and his paycheck hadn't gone through, but it was all sorted out now and everything had been squared away. I told my dad that that man reminded me of the Rhino from Ninja Turtles, and he seemed to find that hilarious. I thought Mom was calm and fine too, but in retrospect, she clearly wasn't. I went to bed more relaxed that night. It was around 1 in the morning when I heard the crash. It was coming from downstairs, the sound of wood splintering and the front door being kicked in. I looked out the window in terror to see 3 men coming through our front door, and Rocksteady was taking up the rear. There was commotion from elsewhere upstairs, Mom and Dad reacting to the break-in, I now know, and then smashing and breaking glass from downstairs, and next, screaming and yelling. I could now hear 4 male voices, including my father's, and then my mom screaming. Finally, Barton started crying, adding to the cacophony, and Mom's footsteps came thundering upstairs. I had already locked my door, and she rattled on it. I asked who it was, and she said it was Mom. She said it was good that I'd locked my door and to keep it locked and stay there, and she was going to take Barton into their room. She told me not to come out under any circumstances, and that Daddy was fine, and not to worry. His friends had just come over and they were just being loud. Even at my young age, I knew that this was all nonsense, but I told Mom I'd stay put. So I had to sit there on my bed listening to the 3 men smash up our things downstairs. Dad was yelling for a while, and then I heard another crash, and his voice stopped. I was crying to myself, these heavy sobs, and I felt like my chest was going to burst and my heart would explode. It felt like the chaos went on forever. Eventually, things fell silent and I thought I was safe. And suddenly there was a hammering on my door. The wooden frame shuddered and I screamed. A male voice I didn't recognize called out, telling me to open the door. I'll just call this one Creepshow. And he called me a little B-word and said that if I was Colin's daughter, Colin was my dad, I was gonna suffer. Creepshow started saying all these awful things he was going to do to me that I don't want to repeat here. Stuff that as a little kid I'd never even heard of before. I was still sobbing, crying, and freaking out. Then I heard a bang from out in the hallway, like someone punching a wall. A voice asked what the F Creepshow was talking about, and I recognized the voice as that Rocksteady guy. Creepshow said that Colin's daughter, the little B-word, was hiding in here and he was going to drag her out and show Colin what happened to the daughters of men who don't pay up. Rocksteady absolutely lost it. He started screaming at this guy, saying that I was only 7 years old and what kind of sicko threatens a kid. That they were just here to scare Colin to get what they were owed. But this was way over the line. Creepshow didn't back down and started hurling abuse at Rocksteady. There was a moment of silence, and then suddenly my door came splintering open. A man I didn't even recognize, who I later learned was Creepshow, flew backwards into the room, having just been drop-kicked probably through the door by that Rocksteady guy. And now Rocksteady rushed into the room, grabbed Creepshow from the floor, dragged him up and threw him out. He looked at me, and the terrifying guy I'd been so afraid of suddenly melted away, and his face softened. I've never seen someone transform like that before or since. Rocksteady told me he was sorry. He didn't really mean for things to go this way. And then he returned to beating the absolute crap out of Creepshow for daring to threaten a little girl like that. The outcome of this story is truly bizarre. Rocksteady genuinely felt so bad about bringing that kind of person to our house that he even offered to pay Dad for the damage. Dad was a bit bruised and scared, but ultimately okay. He didn't really want to call the cops because, well, whatever he was involved in probably wasn't very legal. Rocksteady and the other guy, who was just some sidekick that I'd never even saw, promised that they'd take Creepshow away and deal with him. Dad told us later that the 3 men were some bikers he'd hired to work on a project with him, and something had gone wrong with paying them apparently. He made things right with Rocksteady, and after that, Dad went completely straight. I guess it took my life being threatened to finally wake him up. Dad passed away recently, and he lived an honest life ever since that day. I have no idea what happened to Rocksteady or that Creepshow guy, and it's not Rocksteady who causes me to wake up at night, panicking and scared. It's Creepshow. The things he said to me through that door, the punishments he promised to beat out of me, they're not anything that a 7-year-old girl should ever have to hear. No, I'm sure Creepshow isn't even alive anymore. When Rocksteady drop-kicked him through my bedroom door, he looked like he must have been in his 50s even then. He'd had to have been over 80 by now, so I can only hope that he died in pain and misery. But sometimes late at night, I imagine he's still out there, walking up the stairs to my bedroom door. And this time my dad and Rocksteady are no longer around to stop him. A few years back, my wife Gemma and I were headed for a cozy weekend at a cabin in the Catskills when my car crapped out on me about 10 miles outside Tannersville. We've been driving for a couple of hours already on roads that weave through the forests of upstate New York when out of nowhere, the dashboard lights flickered and then went dark. I turned the key over a few times, willing her to start up again, but the engine only coughed. Then, without any signal on our phones, we had no choice but to walk someplace to get help. About a mile or two down the road, we found a small auto shop which honestly felt like a godsend in the circumstances. It was an old, haggard-looking place with grimy windows, but my wife and I didn't mind. We were too happy to have found exactly what we needed when we needed it most. We called out this very cheerful greeting as we walked inside, and then a mechanic promptly appeared from the back. He was probably in his 50s or 60s, and he wasn't nearly as pleased to see us as we were to see him. But we didn't mind, especially when he assured us that he could have our car towed and fixed by the following morning. As we paid, he asked what we were doing in the area. Then, when we mentioned the cabin, he stopped writing on our bill for a moment and just stared at us. He asked where the cabins were, and then we told him, and he paused before saying, "You don't know much about the area, do you?" And we knew that there were cabins to rent at these bargain prices, and we knew it was peaceful and very secluded too, but other than that, we didn't know much at all. The guy gave a sarcastic laugh when we mentioned the bargain prices, and then asked us rhetorically why we thought that was. He then started explaining how the people who lived up around the cabins didn't take kindly to them being built, nor did they take kindly to the people who stayed in them. This was obviously the absolute last thing we wanted to hear. The cabin had been cheaper than many others in the area, but it was still a real nice place that cost us almost $1,000 of our hard-earned cash. We didn't want to just turn tail and run, but there was also the question of how at risk we'd be if we didn't. We asked the mechanic if he thought that we should just cancel, even if it meant losing our money. And he said he wouldn't go that far, not personally anyway, and that as long as we stayed around the cabins and didn't stray too far from the woods, we'd probably be fine. However, he did say that if anything weird started happening around the cabin, if anyone showed up and started trying to intimidate us, that the safest thing to do was to get the hell out of there. He asked if we were armed, and as it happened to be, I brought my cig along just in case there were bears or something. He told me to keep it handy, regardless if we saw or heard anything. And then after waiting for one of his buddies to show up, we managed to get ourselves a ride to the cabin. It was a tense ride, to say the least. Not only because I was super wary of what we'd been told, but me and my wife disagreed on whether the warning was actually genuine or not. See, she'd gotten a completely different read on this mechanic and thought his attitude totally flipped on us once he realized we were tourists staying in this nice, pretty much gentrified cabins. She thought that everything he said afterwards was intended to freak us out and spoil our weekend, and how that was a jerk-off thing to do to two oblivious city folks. And as I said, I didn't agree with her at all. Everything he said felt pretty genuine, and if he secretly hated us, fixing us a ride to the cabin sure was a weird way of showing it. We were both still pretty tense as we arrived, but once we got inside, our spirits were lifted immensely. because not only was the inside just as rustically luxurious as advertised, but a little walk around the perimeter showed nothing but peaceful, barely touched forest. There were no shadowy strangers walking between the trunks, no weird symbols carved into the trees, and while there were plenty of animal noises, they were much more exciting than they were spooky. After our walk, we unpacked our bags and made ourselves some dinner and then kept on enjoying what we thought would be a weekend of peace and quiet. Part of me kept thinking about the mechanic's warning, but as I said, seeing the place up close and taking a walk around did a lot to calm our nerves. Not to mention, I had my gun with me and I was confident in my ability to defend both of us. If anything went wrong, we'd be fine. At least, that's what we told ourselves the afternoon we arrived. What was supposed to be our first night, but ended up being our last, passed uneventfully but not quietly. The forest itself was super loud, something I really didn't expect. There were crickets, owls, and pretty sure I heard a coyote howl too, but there was nothing that passed over the line from cool to creepy, and both me and Gemma slept pretty well. The next morning we got up, took showers, and made some coffee, and then we sat on the porch looking out into the woods, wondering what the hell we were so spooked about during the previous day. At that point, with the woods all peaceful and with fine weather over us, it was like a little slice of woodland heaven right there in front of us. And then out of nowhere, I saw something that changed everything. Maybe 20 to 30 yards out, there was a tree that looked off. One of the thicker branches near the top looked neatly cut and was leaning at an unnatural angle. After picking myself up from our seat on the porch, I walked into the trees to take a look at it. I quickly realized that there was a log jammed into one of the trees and that it was being sandwiched against the trunk by a long stick that had been weaved between the branches. This probably sounds painfully naive to more rural folks, but when I first looked at it, I didn't realize what I was looking at. I thought that it might have been a tree sculpture or something, maybe a Native American thing I hadn't heard of, but then I noticed the wire that had been strung down the tree trunk and it ran off into the underbrush at its base. I took a few more steps along what was roughly a worn trail, following the wire's assumed path with my eyes until I saw it emerge again, only 10 yards ahead of me. It was strung right across the path that I was on, and if I had walked any further, maybe without that coffee, there's a chance that I wouldn't have noticed it at all. But there it was, clear as day, and once I saw it running horizontally across the trail, I realized what it was. It was a trap, and it was intended for us. When I showed Gemma, I saw the look of horror on her face as she too realized what it was. I grabbed the stick and tossed it at the wire, and then when it hit, the wire pulled out the log support and it came crashing down onto the trail almost exactly where the tripwire had been. Gemma yelped when it hit the dirt, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't majorly freaked out too. If I'd been standing there when it fell, I'd have been a dead man. We took another careful walk around the cabin, eyes glued to the ground when we were moving and then looking up into the trees whenever we were still. We found a pile of stones stacked in an unnatural way, and we both decided it looked suspiciously like a marker of some kind. There was also a strip of cloth tied to a branch not far from the cabin, and we wondered if that too was some kind of marker or indicator. As we walked back to the cabin, we decided that we weren't going to stay for another minute. We packed up the rest of our things and walked all the way back to that auto shop. It took us maybe an hour plus to get there, and I was worried that we might get lost along the way, but after hitting the highway, it was a straight shot to the shop. When we arrived, our car was parked out front, and when we went inside to collect the keys, the same mechanic was there. He took one look at our faces and knew we'd found something out there. We told him all about the trap we'd found in the trees, how it would have done some serious damage if we'd triggered it accidentally. He said he'd never heard about any traps before, but he wouldn't put it past the folks up there to lay a few down. He also said he was glad we were okay, and when we said we were headed home early, he offered to refund the money we paid him to fix the car as a gesture of goodwill. I think he knew that we were decent enough to refuse him, but you could tell that he felt genuinely bad for us on account of how shaken up we were. We appreciated it, we really did, but we've also never returned to that area, and we never intend to. When I was a teenager, I used to share this as a ghost story, but then something happened in my adult years that made it very real and somehow a lot scarier than when I thought I'd encountered a spirit. So bear with me. To my child mind, this was a paranormal encounter, but it's not, and you'll find out why in the second half. I know you don't often run supernatural stories lately on the channel, so I wanted to assure you up front that this isn't that, even if it seems so at first. When I was a kid, my family lost our house and we had to downgrade. That's what I was told anyway, but honestly, I love the new house. It was older than our previous zero-lot line house, a row house with 3 floors, a tiny backyard, and an alleyway that ran in between the middle of the houses and then along the back of the properties. To this day, I insist that this new house was better than our much more valuable house from before. The garden was overgrown, filled with mystery and wonder for a kid like me. There was a broken-down greenhouse that contained all sorts of treasures, and the people next door owned a tortoise that would sometimes break into our yard. There was a crumbling shed filled with the remnants of the last owners, and next to that, adjacent to the back alley, was a big pile of trash made up of things from our move, like mattresses and boxes, but also discarded garden equipment, sort of a bunch of statues and ornaments, all sorts of crazy fun things for an 8-year-old boy like me to mess with. The trash pile in the garden was fenced off from within the garden, and the gate had rusted shut. I could climb over it, but I'd been banned from doing so by my mom and was worried about me falling over the fence and impaling myself on a rake or a garden gnome or something. If I wanted to explore the trash paradise, I had to exit through the front door, walk a few houses down, and then head down the alleyway and around the back of the houses where the trash pile had a much more accessible gate. And this is what I was doing on the day this happened. I walked down the long, dark, and honestly a bit scary arched tunnel leading to the open-air back alley. There was all sorts of old graffiti on the bricks, and not spray paint or tags, but scratches using stones from the ground. The neighborhood's past kids had left their mark, and I've always paused to read some of it before continuing on. Janice plus John forever. Betsy and Evelyn lived here 1963, things like that. I still live in my childhood home to this day, so I see these scribblings regularly. I've added a few of my own over the years with some friends. I just read a new one that said something like, Arthur ate his kids, and it put the spooks in me, understandably. So I guess I was a little jumpy when I emerged from the darkness and into the alley. I looked up and down just to see if any of the neighborhood kids were back here, and the alley was completely unoccupied from both ends. I walked past the 3 back gardens that led to my own. When I reached mine, I tried to unlatch the gate, but the metal hook had gotten rusted or stuck somehow since the last time I used it. I was reaching over the fence trying to work out why it wouldn't come unhooked when I felt rough, pinching fingers on my arm. I spun around and came face to face with an ancient-looking man. He wasn't one of those kindly, pleasant-looking old folks. This guy had a mean, spiteful look in his eyes. He had dirty whiskers sprouting from his chin and wiry white hair that had yellowed with tobacco discoloration at the temples. In my memory, his irises were non-existent, just huge black pupils swimming in his scleras. Tufts of hair grew from his nostrils, and his big ears protruded in a way that almost made me laugh. It was hard to laugh with his tight, vicious grip on my arm, though. The man absolutely stank, too, of dampness and just body odor. I tried to pull away, but his fingernails dug into my arm. He asked me what the hell I was doing, snooping back here. I told him I lived here, and he spat out that he thought I was a liar. And when he talked, I saw his teeth weren't just yellow. They were brown, black, or even missing. His breath stank of death. And that's the best I can describe it. My mind immediately went back to the graffiti that I'd just seen. Arthur ate his kids. And this guy certainly smelled like he'd eaten a kid or two in his day. The old man tugged on my arm again hard and made me wince in pain. He called me a liar and a thief and said he'd turn me into the authorities. He told me that I had to come with him so I wouldn't run away. I'd been warned by my parents and teachers about what dirty, stinky old men could do to young boys, even ones as old as 8 and as brave as me, so there was absolutely no way that I was letting him take me anywhere. Besides, even if he was telling the truth and he was going to hand me over to the quote-unquote authorities, I hadn't done anything wrong. The alleyway was public, and the house I was going into was mine. I did the only thing I could think to do, pulled myself free from his arm, and then yeeted myself over the little fence leading into the backyard. Mom was right. There was a danger of impaling myself if I jumped into the trash pile recklessly, and I was damn lucky that I managed to stop with a sharp shard of metal just slightly pressing into my thigh, enough to draw blood and make me wince, but not enough to do any damage. Quickly avoiding further damage from the spike, I turned around to tell the old man triumphantly that I was in my house now and I lived here, and if he liked he could knock on the front door and ask my parents, and they could confirm that I was very much allowed to be here. The leaping to turning process must have taken all of 3 seconds, but when I turned about to face this old man, he was now gone. I was almost disappointed. I was robbed of my righteous indignation and the chance to show an adult that I was right and he was wrong. So I peered over the fence to see where he'd gone. The alleyway was empty. I looked left and right, no sign of the guy. I hadn't heard any of the other back gates open. All the other houses had high fences leading to the alley. It was only my house that had a small temporary fence because they'd taken the main fence down to help us move in, and we hadn't replaced it yet until this trash paradise had been removed. I unlatched the gate, noticing that a stick had been caught in the loop, preventing me from unhooking it. Then I ran to the head of the alley and looked down the tunnel. There was no way that the old man could have simply reached the street already, and yet sure enough, he was gone. I went back into my back garden, thoroughly done with playing outside, and from then on, I had a ghost story to tell. For years I recounted the story of how a ghostly old man had appeared from nowhere, grabbed me, threatened me, and then disappeared into the ether. Of course, most people didn't believe it. They assumed I'd either imagined him and he'd never actually grabbed me, or he had grabbed me and he must have been one of my neighbors. He wasn't one of my neighbors though. Like I said, I still live in that house now, and I met every neighbor from back then. Nobody remotely matched his description, and I never saw him again, and I know that he didn't disappear into one of the back gardens. I never really considered one of the 2 options that must have happened though. Either the man snuck through the fence leading to the other side of the alley, which led to a retirement home, or he sprinted away when I broke free of his grasp, fast enough to have disappeared when I went looking. I'm going to guess it was the former though, because many years later, I found out that the old man had come from the retirement home. It's more believable that he snuck through some type of unseen hole in the fence than this old-ass man sprinted away faster than a college athlete. So why was this dirty old man lurking in the alleyway behind my house, grabbing an unsuspecting kid? I met up with a friend a couple of years ago who works in law enforcement. He asked me if I was still living at my address, and I said yeah. He'd said he'd thought about me recently because a case he was working on had involved someone who lived at the retirement home in the 90s. Apparently the guy had been a violent offender in his heyday and had spent quite a bit of time in prison. Then eventually he'd been released and ended up at that very retirement home. My buddy wouldn't tell me exactly what this guy had done, but he was horrified and almost actively angry at the fact that I'd never been informed that such a violent offender lived behind my property. After I met with my buddy, I asked my parents if they'd ever known about it, and they hadn't, so I guess we just didn't have to be informed back then. Now back to the present with my buddy though, he told me that the guy was long dead now and that he'd cropped up as a potential accomplice of a current suspect they had who was part of a ring. So my buddy was curious if I'd never seen anyone being weird with kids around my area. He described the man, and while I can't be sure because ultimately he was generic skeevy old white dude, it very much sounded like the ghost who grabbed me in the alley. And I reminded my friend about my true ghost story from my childhood, which I told him and others a bunch of times, and we both went a bit pale and quiet. Honestly, I think I preferred it when I thought the old fogey was just some ghost. I can look back on a ghostly encounter with wonder and excitement. But a near miss with an old pederast, though, well, that's a lot more traumatic. Almost 20 years ago, I joined a volunteer search party looking for a missing kid up in the Catskills. It was a cold morning when I showed up at this place called Platte Clove Valley, a retiree with too much free time on my hands and a nagging need to do something useful with myself. The kid was a 6-year-old boy, last seen chasing a stray dog into the woods. The police had called the volunteers for help, and then myself and about 50 other volunteers answered the call. Under the supervision of cops and professional search and rescuers, we searched all morning without any luck. It rained in the afternoon and about a dozen people headed home soaking wet. The rest of us were told that we were welcome to carry on searching into the night, so that's what we did. It made for a tough going. It was very cold, it rained again, and the nature of the terrain meant that we were almost constantly walking up one hill after the other. The group spread out in a loose line of these bobbing flashlights, and we called the boy's name over and over, and some of us yelled till we lost our voice. My back got really stiff from the hours of walking, and after a while it started to really hurt, but I kept moving. The thought of some kid out there all alone and afraid kept me going long into the night. I'd like to say that all of my fellow volunteers were good eggs, but one caught my eye early on, and not for the right reasons. He was quiet, kept to himself, and was always lingering at the edge of the group. He wore this faded green jacket, the hood pulled low over his face when it rained, and he moved with a very strange kind of caution about him. I thought that was because he was paying attention to his surroundings, but after a while I wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't know his name, nobody seemed to. He'd shown up with the rest of us, nodded at the police briefing, and then followed along. I didn't notice anything at first, but after a while, I did. He didn't call out for the boy like the rest of us did. He just walked, head down with his hands in his pockets, like he was just sort of going through the motions. And as the night dragged on, our group got more and more tense. Some of us had been there more than 12 hours, and we'd walked miles upon miles of woods without finding anything whatsoever. And there was no sign of the boy. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, nothing. The other volunteers were starting to crack from the exhaustion, and I was feeling it myself. But it wasn't just that. It was that sort of creeping dread that settles in when hope starts to fade, and people start considering the worst. We'd all been so hopeful that morning, but that night, all that cheerfulness was gone, and was replaced by something very dark. Around that same time, I noticed the man in the green jacket avoiding a particular stretch of the valley he'd been assigned to search. It was a rocky area, thick with brambles and fallen logs, but it wasn't impassable. We'd been told to check every inch of our grids, but he steered clear, always finding a reason to drift into other areas that were already being covered. At one point, I saw him staring into the ravine that he seemed to be avoiding, His flashlight beam was just kind of lingering on it for a moment before he turned and walked away. I felt my heart sink as suspicion crept into my mind. It wasn't just that he was avoiding it. It was like he knew something we didn't. I tried to shake it off. I was almost completely exhausted, so I was kind of mad at myself for jumping to conclusions. But then I saw him do it a second time, skirting that exact same way near the ravine. I remember watching his steps quicken as he passed it. The other volunteers didn't seem to notice. They were too focused on their own patches of ground, but I did. I kept my eyes on him for a while and then decided to search the ravine myself. I walked down the valley, past the man in the green jacket, and was no more than a few feet into the ravine when I spotted something ahead of me, lit up by the beam of my flashlight. And the sight of it stopped me cold. I remember my flashlight sweeping over the dirt, and there it was. A small blue toy car, half buried in the leaves. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, because it was the toy the boy had with him when he ran off into the woods. It was scratched, with one wheel bent, but it perfectly matched the description the boy's parents had given. I called out to the rest of the group. The first to arrive was one of the police officers, and I showed him the toy right away. I didn't say anything about the man in the green jacket, not yet. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but most of all I didn't want to stir up trouble in a group that was already on edge. The man in the green jacket reappeared, slipping back into the group like he'd never left. I watched him as he stood at the back, his hood still up and his hands still stuffed deep in his pockets. I was convinced that he'd seen the toy, but had chosen not to report it, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I suddenly pulled one of the officers aside, and in a low voice, I told him what I'd seen. I told him how the man avoided the ravine, and how he seemed to know more than he let on. The officer listened and nodded along, then when I was done, he thanked me for letting him know and said he'd discuss what he'd heard with his fellow officers. He didn't do anything right away, so I figured they weren't going to act on the word of some exhausted and half-crazy old person. But a little while later, I saw two officers approach the man in the green jacket. They stepped away from the group and I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the man's shoulders stiffen as he became very defensive. They talked for a few minutes with the man gesturing, and then he turned and walked off into the dark. Around 1 a.m, before I left, I asked the officer what had happened when he spoke to the man in the green jacket. He said the man had been questioned, had denied knowing anything about the boy's disappearance, and had been so offended at having to justify himself that he actually left the search entirely. Now, having made a note of his name on his ID, they knew who he was, but he was unlikely to be questioned unless the investigation pointed in his direction. And I understood. The police can't just arrest someone on some hunch. But on the walk back to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the green jacket and about that ravine he'd avoided. And the next day I went back for a second day of searching, but the mood seemed to be different. Nobody talked much, there weren't as many smiles, and even when people did, the smiles never seemed to reach their eyes. The man in the green jacket didn't show up again, but his absence felt louder than his presence ever had. One little talk with the cops and he just quit. And it didn't sit right with me, and I don't think it ever will. I didn't find out what happened to the boy or what the man in the green jacket knew, and since he was never arrested, at least to my knowledge, I have to accept that I'm going to die not knowing. And that, my friend, is a very bitter pill to swallow. So me and my family moved to a new town in the early 2000s. Dad got a promotion at work, so we upgraded and moved to a nice place in the suburbs. Me and my sister got to attend a better school, Mom got to meet some new friends, and Dad had a much shorter drive to work. Everything was great. I was really excited to move, and I'd never moved to a different house before, and it seemed like a wild adventure. These days I look back and think what an idiot I was. Moving houses isn't something that I wish on my worst enemy, even under positive circumstances. It's so freaking stressful. But back then I was a 6-year-old kid, so the world was all sunshine and rainbows. I'd never known true fear or suffering. At least until the day this all happened. I remember that day that I had an argument with my sister. We were twins, so even as brother and sister, we almost never argue. She's my best friend and I hung out with her nearly all the time, so I was really salty and upset that this day we'd fallen out. I don't even remember why, but I definitely remember that it was her fault. Hi Holly, if you're listening to this, you know I'm gonna send it to you, if Let's Read narrates it. We'd lived in the neighborhood for about 6 months by this point, but I'd only met and befriended the kids that lived across the street, brothers Mike and Joe. Most of the other houses were occupied by older folks. It was kind of a quiet community, perfect for older couples but less popular for families with kids. I knew there was one other family though, just at the end of the cul-de-sac around the corner. They were a big family, mom, dad, 3 sisters, and a brother. We knew them vaguely from church, and they were known as an extremely nice, friendly family, so I thought nothing of just wandering around their house and knocking for them to see if they wanted to come play. 2 of them did, the girl my age, Kathy, and her brother, Will. We played various ball games and whatever other silly things kids enjoyed back then. It was fun, and I liked them. Then, from a field across the road, a group of other kids came strolling over. One of them was Will's friend and a few other kids, and then Will's friend's cousin, who was a chunky, loud, and angry girl called Hester. Hester was about 10, so older than most of us, and she lorded that fact over the other kids. Immediately I could tell that she was an insufferable little brat, and after just an hour she started picking on 5 or 6 different kids in turn, making people cry or turn on each other in the way that bullies do. Of course, because Hester was such an obnoxious, unpleasant person, everyone wanted to impress her. And that's how it is when you're kids, I guess. After a bit, Hester declared that our neighborhood was fake and gay and dumb, and if us stupid kids knew what was good for us, we'd follow her across the field to a much cooler place. None of us were allowed to go that far from home, and none of us wanted to get hurt by Hester either, as she would be threatening. And the place that Hester led us to was actually cool. It was the beginnings of a park, sort of half set up and half under construction. A set of monkey bars and a swing set had already been set up, and a teeter-totter and a merry-go-round were abandoned on the green half covered in plastic. I guess it says something about the nature of the area that these things were just left there waiting for construction to resume after the weekend, and that the area wasn't fenced off or anything. And like moths to the flame, some of the kids waddled wide-eyed over to the swings and began playing there. And Hester commanded everyone to follow her though, and led us to a stack of concrete tubes. They were stacked in a pyramid shape, 3 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, 1 on the top. "Who's brave enough to go inside?" Hester screeched, pointing at the middle tube on the bottom. And this seemed like a terribly stupid idea. The tubes were fastened together with some kind of metallic straps that held them in place, but even then, and even at 6, I was aware that these tubes were potentially incredibly dangerous, and incredibly stupid that anyone had left them unattended. "I'll do it," I said. So I got down on my hands and knees and carefully, nervously crawled into the tube. And I called that I was in, and then behind me, the light disappeared. I tried to turn around and discovered that the tube was just too small for me to turn around in. And that's how I discovered that I suffer from crippling claustrophobia. I began to panic almost immediately, backing down the tube. My foot pressed against something. Hester and the other kids had put some kind of board or block over the exit. I tried to force against it, but the concrete scraped my bare knees and I couldn't get any trajectory to kick back against whatever they were holding there. And frantically, I already started to cry. I began to sort of crawl down the pipe towards the other end. It was very slow going, The pipe was about 20 feet long, made of rough, spiky concrete and little stones that dug painfully into my knees. I was about halfway to the end when Hester's face appeared in front of me at the end of the tube. She yelled at me that I was stuck in there and called me a little crybaby. This, of course, made me cry, which made the other kids start laughing at me, taunting me to impress Hester. Her ugly face looked in again, and then everything went dark as they covered that end of the tube with a board too. I began to absolutely freak out, screaming and crying. I looked over my shoulder and saw from behind me. I realized they only had one board to cover the exit and were running back and forth outside. I began moving backwards, pleading with them to let me out. I heard Hester yell, and just as I'd neared the other end, light poured in far ahead of me and they covered the exit and freedom yet again. Like I said, I'd never experienced my true fear or suffering until that point, but suddenly it was like a little imp was sitting on my shoulders, punching me rapidly and repeatedly in the temples. I began absolutely hollering, crying, screaming, and begging them to let me out. Hester laughed and yelled at me to go to the other end, that the board was stuck, but I could get out if I crawled. So I crawled, blinking towards the light through my tears, and sure enough, when I was near the end, the kids jeered and howled at me, and then covered the end instead. And this process went on a couple of more times, each time with Hester promising me that they'd let me out this time, and each time they'd cover the exit. And by now I was cut up and bloody and screaming and obviously crying, and to this day I don't know what kind of psychopathic little brat Hester must have been to keep this up. In defense of the other kids, by now a few of them were arguing with her, shouting at her even, and I didn't know it, but Kathy and Will had already left to go get an adult at this point. As far as I knew from within my concrete tomb, though, all of those kids were out there enjoying it, and they wanted me dead. I don't know if I had some kind of actual seizure or if it was just a panic attack, but I began flailing and kicking. My skin burned with agony as I punched and kicked the concrete interior of the tube. I don't know what I was trying to do, if I thought that I could break my way out or something, but regardless, something did break. I heard a cracking, a crumbling noise, heard a metallic snap, and then felt a seismic shifting as the tubes on top of me began to roll. All hell broke loose. Hester and the other kids began screaming in fear. I started to roll, dust from the concrete tube stinging my eyes and making it almost impossible to see. I was pretty much in the middle of the damn tube. Blissful, blessed light flooded in from ahead of me, and I began to scramble as quick as I could towards freedom. I knew that I was in genuine, serious danger of actually dying if I didn't. As I reached the end, I felt hands on me dragging me roughly out of the tube, and I was pulled out onto the grass. Then I heard this rumble and a crunch, and heard the most haunting, ear-splitting scream, the worst sound I'd ever heard in my life. Kathy and Will's dad, Jack, was the one who pulled me to safety. They'd gone and told him what Hester was doing, and he'd come out to check and then rushed over in horror when he saw what the kids were doing to me. Meanwhile, Holly had come to apologize and witnessed me being pulled from the concrete tube seconds before it cracked and caved in on itself. If Jack hadn't pulled me out those last few feet, I genuinely don't think that I'd be here to write this story, at least not in one piece. The horrific scream that I heard had come from Hester's cousin, George, Will's friend who lived nearby. One of the concrete tubes had just rolled off the stack and literally crushed his leg. I caught a glimpse of it as I was carried away by Jack, and holy crap, it was like there wasn't even a leg there. He was eventually fine, thankfully, but he had to have multiple metal pins surgically inserted into his leg, and a bunch of physical therapy, and Hester's family had to foot the entire bill. I have no idea what happened to her, and I wish her all the best, and I hope she went on to have a great and fulfilling life. Just kidding. I don't think I can really say what I feel about her without getting you demonetized. And so that's the childhood trauma that still keeps me up at night to this day. I still can't stay in enclosed spaces. Even elevators make me panic, and While I can manage them if I have to, I'd always rather take the stairs. I've been photographing wildlife around Balsam for years when this happened. Trail cameras were my eyes when I wasn't there, and I'd rig them to the trees and they'd snap motion-triggered shots day and night. Now that summer that this happened, I set up 5 cameras near a stream where bears often wandered, and the plan was simple. I'd leave them for a week, retrieve the footage, and sort through the images for keepers. But I ended up getting way more than I bargained for. The first sign of trouble came when I reviewed the footage back at my cabin. Most of the cameras had captured what I'd hoped for. Bears lumbering through the brush with their eyes glinting that sort of infrared glow. But one camera, tucked much deeper in the woods, showed something else. One night, a man walked into shot. But not some hiker or camper. This guy looked like he'd been living wild for years. His clothes were torn and filthy, and after walking into the shot, he'd started digging in the dirt with his hands, just sort of clawing at the earth like some type of animal. His movements were frantic, almost feral, but he never once looked at the camera, and I assumed that he hadn't seen it. I remember staring at the grainy images, my mouth just kind of hanging wide open, just completely astounded by what I was seeing. Who the hell was he, and what the hell was he doing out there? The footage obviously gave no concrete answers. All I had were pictures of him scraping at the ground in the middle of the night. It wasn't so much what he was doing either. It was the way he was doing it. Something about the way he moved, the way his head twitched as he worked, it scared the crap out of me. So, rather than be in the same section of the forest as this dude, I decided to retrieve the cameras the next day, a whole 2 days earlier than planned. I wanted those images safe, and I didn't like the idea of being alone in the woods with someone like that walking around at night. The next morning, I hiked back to the stream where I'd rigged the cameras. I found the first camera easily, but the second I saw it, my heart sank. The lens was shattered and the casing cracked like someone had taken a rock to it. I checked the next one and found the same thing. Someone had smashed it to pieces. By the third one, my hands were already shaking with anger. 4 out of 5 were ruined, with their memory cards either missing or found crushed on the ground where they'd been rigged. Only one camera, deepest in the woods, was still intact. I hesitated before checking it, as part of me wanted to grab it and just leave, but I needed to know what was on it. So I popped out the memory card and slid it into my portable viewer. The first few clips were normal, just animals of varying shapes and sizes. And then I saw him, the same man in the same tattered clothes, but this time, he wasn't digging. He was standing right in front of the camera, staring into the lens. His face filled the frame, very pale, gaunt-looking, with big dark circles under his eyes. His lips moved like he was muttering something, but the camera didn't pick up sound. His eyes locked onto the lens like he knew something was watching. I shut off the viewer, yanked the camera from the tree, and got the hell out of there. I stuffed the camera in my backpack and started back toward the trailhead. My car was a 2-mile hike away, but every step felt like it took forever. The forest didn't feel peaceful at all anymore. Now I couldn't shake the image of that guy's face and the way those hollow eyes seemed to stare right through the lens. What did he want? Why had he smashed the cameras? And why had he left that one, the one with a video of him? It almost felt like a message, and one that was easily understood. It clearly said, "Leave now." And I tried to reassure myself, thinking that maybe he was just some hermit spooked by the cameras, but deep down, I knew better. He looked right at me through the lens. He'd clearly wanted me to see him. After an hour or so of very tense walking, the trail opened up and I saw the faint outline of the clearing where I'd parked. I walked over to my car, and then when I reached it, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see him staring back at me. but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. But I knew he was out there, and that was enough to send a shiver through me. I climbed into the car, slammed the door and locked it, and I drove all the way home without stopping. I didn't go back to Balsam after that. The footage from the last camera stayed on the memory card unviewed, and I couldn't bring myself to watch it again and see his face. I packed up my gear and moved my work to a different range, far from those woods. The bears of Balsam Lake would have to wait. I have an absolutely weird story for you, and it drives me nuts that I've never been able to work out the exact truth behind it. So maybe you and your listeners can give me some theories. At the very least, maybe it'll help me stop having nightmares about it if I finally talk about it to strangers on the internet. It was a pretty bad week to start with. Mom had asked her friend if I could stay with them in the weekdays before she had to do a work thing. Mom's friend had 2 kids, Benny and Daniel. Benny was my age and was my friend from school, and Daniel was younger. She was kind of a whiny, wet blanket kid who was constantly crying and moaning and kicking up a fuss about stuff. And that's why Benny and I didn't really take it seriously that day when Daniel fell and wouldn't get up. Instead, he just sat there, screaming and crying, saying, "It hurts, it hurts." We laughed at him to start with. It had only been a little fall, tripping backwards onto his butt. But when he carried on crying, we realized that maybe he was serious this time. Long story short, he had fallen backwards against the furnace of this fireplace thing and cracked his tailbone. Easy enough to recover from, but it required a hospital trip. And there was no way that Benny and Daniel's mom, Nancy, was going to tolerate Benny and I under her feet in a hospital waiting room all day. So Nancy called her friend, Kate, and asked if she could look after Benny and his friend they were babysitting, aka me. Kate was the mother of Elena and Carl. Elena was our friend from school, so we knew her. And sorry if this is some tangle web of confusion, but this is important. Me, Benny, and Elena were 7. Carl was 5, and Kate was their mom who was looking after us for the day while Benny, who was 4, was getting checked out in the hospital. Another important part, Kate and her husband Arnold were absolutely rich. They lived in a house that, to me as a kid, was completely huge and daunting. It was built in the 19th century, if not before, and in my memory it was like 8 stories. I'm sure it can't have been that big in retrospect, but it was this very old country house that had been in their family for probably generations at this point. Creepy portraits of various old members of their family hung on the oak-paneled walls. They had a housekeeper, a gardener, and a maid. And there were at least 2 grandfather clocks in the house, and I swear to God there was a genuine suit of armor in one of the corridors. The whole house was absolutely mysterious and wonderful and fascinating, and it smelled of old things. There were numerous cabinets and cupboards to explore, and various closed doors that were tantalizing and appealing, and there was even a music room filled with instruments, including a piano that I was absolutely ready to try out, as I was this up-and-coming pianist who'd passed 3 grades already. Naturally, because it was such a cool house with so much promise and excitement, we were allowed to stay in the freaking hallway, where we were given a box of toys and told to sit on the floor and play all morning. Elena and Carl were both really pale and quiet and pretty weird, and they seemed a little scared of their mom. Hell, me and Benny were scared of their mom. She was strict in a I want to seem cool and hip, but I also hate kids way, and clearly resented having to raise her own children, let alone look after Benny and I for the day. And I am pretty sure that she wasn't actually Elena's biological mom, but I never had any contact with the family after this one day. Things just didn't fully add up in my young boy mind, and all this just contributes to the mystery in my head. Elena called her Kate and Carl called her Mom, and at the time, I could not for the life of me work out how or why this was possible. I guess I didn't grasp the idea of a stepmom not being called mom back when I was 7. After a few hours of mind-numbing boredom in which we were forced to play with toys that were for babies, we had lunch. I forget what it was, but I remember it being the most boring, bland lunch I've ever eaten, and I remember thinking that I was glad that we didn't have a big, valuable house if it meant that you had to eat boring crap as a sort of compromise. Benny was normally the class clown, but I guess he'd been babysat by Kate before because he was on his best boring behavior that day. He'd barely talk, in fact, and it was really unsettling to see my friend acting so muted. He was normally the leader, and he would get us into all sorts of trouble. After lunch, Kate allowed us to play in the garden, which was a sprawling, mysterious wonderland of trees. There was a pond, flower beds, and a vegetable garden. So of course, we were only allowed to stay on the patio area, in sight of Kate at all times while she sat in the kitchen watching daytime TV. After half an hour, it began to rain, and Elena and Carl would apparently catch pneumonia if they stayed in the rain, so off we all went back to the cold tiled hallway where we had to play with baby toys again. After a while, Kate announced that she was going to take a nap, and I watched her disappear up 2 flights of stairs. Not that she'd been watching us before, she'd been in the other room with the door half open, but now that Kate had fully left, I was hoping it meant that we could actually do something a bit more exciting. I suggested this to the others, but Elena seemed horrified and said that we had to do what Kate said and we'd better stay in the hallway playing with Carl's jigsaw puzzles because it wouldn't be good to get into trouble. Benny had gone to the bathroom and hadn't come back for 10 minutes. I looked around at the home with this very sad longing. Surely there had to be something cool we could do. I asked Elena if the house was haunted, and Carl began to sniffle, and Elena explained that he was afraid of ghosts. God, what a crybaby. He made Danny look like a badass, and Elena explained that no, there were no ghosts here. I asked who else lived there, and she said it was just her, Kate, and their dad, who was always away during the week in the city. Even at 7 years old, I knew enough to feel bad for Elena here. Kate clearly wasn't a nice mom, and I kinda understood why Elena was always on her own and lonely at school. I asked about the house staff, and Elena said that they came from the nearby village a few days a week. And I found it incredible that such a huge house could have so few people living in it, especially when the kids seemingly weren't allowed in most of the rooms. Benny still wasn't back, and I needed to use the bathroom. At first, Elena said that I'd have to wait, but then she relented and said that there was one upstairs as long as I promised not to touch or break anything. I needed to pee so bad I thought that I was actually going to wet myself, so I promised her on my life. She told me it was upstairs and on the left, so I ran upstairs, quiet as I could so Kate wouldn't hear and yell at me. I found the bathroom, and it looked and smelled like my great Nan's bathroom, full of pink doilies and one of those knitted toilet roll covers with a doll's body in it. None of it looked like it belonged to a young modern family, and the whole place was so weird. I washed my hands and left the bathroom. I was about to go downstairs and behave myself, honestly, but then I heard sounds coming from one of the rooms. I knew Kate had gone up to the next floor and their dad was away for work, so I thought maybe Benny had come upstairs even though there was no way that he could have gotten up here without seeing me. I approached the door. I heard another sound from inside, and it sounded like a person in distress. To this day, I would swear that I heard the word help. I opened the door, and the sight that lay inside stays with me into adulthood. It was my first real experience of seeing a genuinely sick person. A 4-poster bed sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by translucent medical-style curtains. Monitors and machines beeped from beside the bed. I didn't recognize them at the time, but since I know there was at least a heart monitor and some kind of machine to aid with breathing. There were a couple of other machines there too that I can't even begin to tell you the function of. The room stank of illness and antiseptic. It had the function of a hospital room, but otherwise it was like the rest of the house. Oak-paneled walls, old furniture, fancy cabinets, and yes, another grandfather clock. It was just the bed, the machines, and the person in the bed that were out of place. I took a step in the room, trying to see more details of the figure that lay in the bed. I genuinely can't be sure if I'm misremembering this, but in my head, I remember her being fully covered in a sheet, almost like a shroud. I genuinely thought that I was looking at a dead body at first. Then I realized the machines at least suggested that the person was alive, and looking closer, I could see the sheet rising and falling as the person breathed. I had a vague understanding of what a coma was, and it occurred to me that this mysterious person hidden away in the bedroom of this huge house might be in one. At least I considered this for a moment when the figure sat bolt upright and yanked the curtain covering the bed away. The person in the bed was a woman. She can't have been older than Kate or Nancy or my own mom, but she looked severely aged at the same time. Her hair was slicked back with sweat, her skin pale and gaunt. She looked a bit like Elena, but ancient. The woman held out a hand to me, and I thought that she was calling to me. She started making sounds with her mouth, this sort of clicking coming from her throat, then moaning, but nothing I could recognize as words. And then her eyes snapped open wide, and so did her mouth, and it was like she was screaming, but silently. Again, I can't be sure if this was just in my head, as the stories become more terrifying to me over the years, but I'm sure she pointed at me. I let out a little scream, turned, ran, and thundered down the stairs. When I asked Elena who the woman in the room was, she looked completely pale and sick. She told me it was her mom, and I told her that no, it wasn't. It was a sick woman, not Kate. Dumbass me couldn't grasp that mom was someone else. Benny had returned from the bathroom by this point, and I started frantically telling him about the sick woman upstairs. His eyes widened, and he said that we should go and check on her. Elena started whispering in panic to us, saying that we mustn't go back upstairs. Carl, of course, started crying again. And before we could do anything, Kate came storming down. And I had never been yelled at by my friend's mom before in a way that Kate screamed at me then, calling me a disobedient little brat, a troublemaker, all sorts of things. I burst into tears. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. I thought someone was in trouble in the room, so I checked on them, and then when I realized I'd disturbed some sick lady, I'd left. Kate was having none of it though, and said that there was no way that she was putting up with this. She used a lot more swear words than that, and I remember being shocked at an adult talking to me that way. She called up Nancy, who luckily had just gotten out of the hospital with Danny. Kate stared at us silently for 20 minutes it took for Nancy to come collect us. Nancy scolded us repeatedly on the drive home, then made us sit in the utility room for the last hour of the day until Mom came to pick me up. I heard Mom and Nancy talking in quiet voices. Then on the way home, I told Mom exactly what had happened. I guess Mom took my side because that night I heard her on the phone yelling at Nancy that it wasn't appropriate to send me to be looked after by Kate anyway, and that nobody had the right to yell at her kid and punish him for something that he hadn't even done wrong. They stopped being friends after that, and Benny and I kind of stopped hanging out shortly after, which was fine by me because he was always getting me in trouble anyways. I didn't really expect the incident to have such a long-lasting effect in my mind as it has. I have absolutely no idea what was going on in that house. When I saw Elena at school the next week, she was quiet and wouldn't talk to me and had bruises on her arms. I wish I'd been able to do something about it back then. I'm pretty sure some kind of abuse was going on in that household, but as a 7-year-old, I didn't have the vocabulary or know-how to say or do anything about it. I never did find out who that woman was, although I can hazard an educated guess that it was Elena's mom. My own mom has always been under the impression that Elena's mom was dead, so I have no idea why she was sealed away in a room in that house, hooked up to machines. I wish I could solve this mystery. And like I said, maybe your listeners have some theories, but in the meantime, I guess I'll continue waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by nightmares of a dying woman, sitting upright in her sick bed, throwing back her shroud and pointing, straight at me. This is a story that happened to me in the UK when I was a kid. Me and my buddy Jim used to hang out at this local park near his house quite a lot, where we'd chill on the swings, smoke on the bench, play a bit of football, you know, the kind of crap teenagers get up to at the park. We were honestly good friends, goody two-shoes even, and just never got up to anything sordid, really. I had a couple of friends who made a hobby of setting fires inside public toilets, like inside the actual toilet bowls, and they'd recently been yanked into the cop shop for a warning, and it had kind of traumatized the poor lads, so Jimbo and I were extra determined to keep our noses clean and be good kids. We were walking back to my house down a street we'd walked down a billion times. Most of the buildings along the street were houses, but a few of them were houses that had been converted into the premises for business. I forget what exactly there was, but one of them was a taxi rank. So they used the living room as a makeshift office, which you could see into through these huge bay windows at the front. There was a 2-car driveway which could house 2 of the taxis, then a couple of other taxis would park on the street. I guess then people would call up and book a taxi and they'd dispatch it to a location, etc. This was years before Uber, back when in the UK anyway, there would just be a designated area in town and whatever for taxis to wait in, or outside the cinema or Hollywood Bowl and all of that. I guess the taxis stayed on this residential street when they weren't in use because the headquarters were there. I could never work out why they needed a whole house as the taxi rank, nor could I imagine what was in the other rooms. I can make a good guess now, but I don't want to spoil anything. Anyway, I'll call these Jabens Munter taxis because it's as good a name as any. So me and Jimbo were making our way home past Munter taxis when I had to stop to do my shoelace up. These were the days before ChatGPT and Skibbity toilets, so you had to tie your own damn shoes back then. So that's what I did. I stopped and crouched down and began to tie my lace. Shock horror. I guess I'd accidentally decided to stop next to one of Munter Taxi's cars though, because within seconds of me dropping to my knees, the door to the taxi rank burst open and an angry middle-aged Turkish guy came charging out. He hooted at the top of his voice, screaming at Jimbo and me. What were we doing? Why had we stopped there? What were we trying to do to his effing taxi? He was sick of us damn R-word kids effing up their cars. Were we cops? Were we keying the taxi? Wait, were we cops? Huh? Now I jumped to my feet, gesturing to my half-tied lace, and told him that I had in fact stopped to tie my shoelace. The Turkish man almost exploded in rage at this. I was absolutely baffled. He grabbed me and slammed me against the taxi, which, yeah, nice one, mate. If you're worried about someone vandalizing your stupid arse car, then good idea slamming a body up against it. And Jimbo, of course, decided that now was the perfect time to start taunting this taxi boss, calling him a prick and demanding that he let go of me, that we weren't doing anything wrong. But if he didn't let me go there and then he'd have a lot to reckon with. And I have no idea what Jimbo even had in mind. I don't think he'd ever thrown a punch in his entire life, and still probably hasn't, but he was a mouthy sod at times. Taxi wanker was having none of it, and dragged me forward, then slammed me back again. Then he threw me aside and pointed at the car. He screamed that I'd put a dent in it when I'd tied my shoelace, and I helpfully pointed out that it was probably when he slammed me against the taxi just then. And this caused him to grab me and punch me in the stomach. Not very hard, but enough to bring tears to my eyes. Jimbo started yelling at him again, this time taking things a bit more seriously. Meanwhile, 2 younger guys came out of the taxi rank, a white guy and another Turkish lad. The Turkish lad looked a bit apologetic, but the white guy was someone I'd seen driving the taxis around town before, a bit of a hard nut. He was holding a plank, getting ready to raise it like he was about to brain me with it. this plank guy started yelling at us alongside the taxi driver, and he said that we were the kids who had been repeatedly vandalizing their taxis and that we were gonna effing pay now that they'd caught us. I had never touched the damn taxis before, apart from actually using their services a few times, and I told them this. I said we lived nearby and were just walking home, and I'd stopped to tie my lace. I again pointed out that my lace was untied, and if they'd just look, they'd see that I hadn't done anything to the freaking taxi. Young Turk leaned in and whispered something to this taxi guy. Plank guy did that thing that the hard kids in schools do, where they lunge at you and then stop, trying to intimidate me. He waved the plank around, and I genuinely thought that he was going to hit me for a second. Jimbo had his phone out, and this was the days of the Nokia 3310s, so we didn't have cameras and stuff like that, but we did have the means to call the law. Jimbo said he was going to dial 999 because we had nothing to hide, and this caused Taxi Wanker to freak out. He started screaming and hollering that if we called the law, we'd be dead men. And Christ on a cracker, buddy, overreacting much? And that's when I twigged that maybe something more serious was going on here than a taxi firm being protective over their vehicles. I figured we probably needed to extricate ourselves from the situation pretty sharply, and I shot Jimbo a look, hoping he'd understand exactly what I was thinking. Instead, he called the men a bunch of tossers. Well, nothing for it. I shoved Taxi Wanker with all my might, knocking him into the plank man, and then Jimbo and I pounded sand and ran down the street, darting across the busy main road and narrowly missing being flattened by the number 8 bus to Staple Grove. Then we were back at my house and home free. My stomach hurt where Taxi Wanker had punched me, but other than that we were safe, and we vowed that we wouldn't take that shortcut back from the park anymore and thought nothing of it. Now a few months later, my dad showed me a story in the paper. A local taxi firm had been shut down for their role in distributing heroin and cocaine. And get this, smuggling blood diamonds. And yep, of course, it was Munter Taxis. So I guess that's why they used an entire house as their headquarters, storing and packing drugs, and again, I emphasize this, blood diamonds. Now Jimbo and I almost came a cropper from honest-to-God blood diamond smugglers. That's kind of badass, if not a bit terrifying, and in retrospect, it's no wonder they got so touchy-feely about me stopping to tie my shoe. This story happened to my mom in the 60s, but she's given me permission to share it with you today. She was about 4 years old and playing with her friends at a local park. It was a whole group of them hanging out in the swings and whatnot. Back then, kids just played without supervision, and we see that as the good old days, but sometimes it's understandable why modern parents are a bit stricter on where their kids can go. Now, this was back in the United Kingdom. Parks used to have a park keeper who would be employed by the council to maintain the grass, keep the play park equipment working, things like that. And now everything is done by outside contractors. But back in the day it used to be a guy, usually a retiree who wore a park keeper uniform and had a little shack on the corner of the park. Most park keepers would become a popular staple with the kids who played there, and Mr. Claude was no different. Mum says he was a friendly old lad with a twinkle in his eye and a bag of toffees he'd secretly offer to his favorite kids, one of whom was my mum. Mr. Claude was friends with my grandparents too. He'd been a local fixture in the town for as long as they could remember even, and everyone had fond opinions of the old fella. And that's why when Mr. Claude approached Mum in the park that day, she thought nothing of it. He called her over, away from her friends, and patted the bench under the tree for her to sit down. Mum joined him, and he asked if she was having a good day, if she was having fun, if she'd be starting school that autumn, just usual friendly chit-chat from the town's grandpa. Mum was a polite kid who loved to befriend and please adults, so she was only too happy to answer his questions. Mr. Claude reached into his pocket and withdrew his traditional rumpled paper bag of toffees, which he'd buy from the local corner shop. He gave Mum a toffee, and then after a minute, he asked her if she liked kittens. Of course, what little kid doesn't like kittens? So Mum said yes, and Mr. Claude told her that the park cat, Shelley, had recently had kittens and they were in his park keeper's shack on the other side of the park, if she wanted to see them. Mum did, of course. She hadn't really been briefed that well on stranger danger, but she says that even if she had, it was Mr. Claude, so she would have trusted him enough to go with him. Go with him she did, and he led her by the hand to his hut. Inside, he locked the door, not that Mum realized that at the time, and then had her sit on a stool. She looked around but couldn't see Shelley or the kittens anywhere. Mr. Claude made a point of trying to find the kittens and couldn't, and then pulled a little cat sock puppet out of a drawer. Mum says he made her laugh pretending it was Shelley, the park cat, and everything seemed fine. And then Mr. Claude reached into the drawer again and pulled out a magazine. He showed it to Mum and asked her what she thought of it. It was a nudie magazine. Mum told him she didn't know and got shy and a bit scared. And then Mr. Claude began flicking through the magazine, showing her increasingly explicit images of women. Mum can't remember for sure, as it was nearly 60 years ago now, but she thinks she remembers it being some kind of fetish magazine. Mr. Claude began asking her, a little girl, if she liked what was in the magazine. Again, Mum said that she didn't know and began to get a bit tearful and scared. Mr. Claude started to get cross with her and told her that a park keeper was a bit like a policeman, and she had to listen to him and do what he said. I don't want to repeat what he told her to do next, but thank God Mum said no. She jumped off that stool and stomped her foot and told him that grown-ups don't say things like that to little girls. She remembers Mr. Claude laughing at this and telling her that she was a precious little brat. We think that he must have said precocious, but this is how she remembers it. And then he grabbed her by the wrist and began trying to guide her hand somewhere. And to this day, I'm sure someone was looking out for Mum, because before Mr. Claude could do anything, there was a harsh knocking at the door. It was Mum's brothers, Jules and Andrew. They'd come looking for Mum to bring her home for tea, and the other little kids told them that Mr. Claude had taken her to his shed. My Uncle Jules says he always suspected that Mr. Claude was a wrong'un, so he ran straight over. Then when they tried to enter the hut and found it locked, they began to panic. Thankfully, Jules' bashing on the door caused Mr. Claude to panic, and he unlocked the door to let Mum go. When they got home, they told my grandparents how Mr. Claude had tried to behave, but they told Mum that she must have misunderstood him, and that sweet old Mr. Claude wouldn't possibly have wanted to hurt Mum, but she should never go alone with adults like that again, but also definitely shouldn't worry or be traumatized by it. I would be so mad at my grandparents for this, except Uncle Jules concluded the story for us. When the rest of the kids had gone to bed, he stayed up and eavesdropped on Granddad talking to a couple of his work buddies about Mr. Claude. They said it was high time that something was done about that dirty old man. The next week, there was a new park keeper at the local park. Nobody heard from Mr. Claude again. The story went that he'd gone up country to live with his son because he was getting on in years. Maybe that's true. Maybe the local dads chased him off. Or maybe they banded together and delivered another kind of old-fashioned justice. Who can say? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, your gray matter is turning blue.